End of the world as we know it, but I feel fine. From the Sunshine State, I'm Greg Carlwood, and it's hard to have convictions about what the truth of anything is in a world so systematically stacked with state propaganda, sophisticated psyops, and engineered opinions as ours is. Complicating things further is this rat's nest of reality-shaping operations and public perception creation goes back about as far as there's been a reality or a perception of it to shape. Nearly every philosophy, organization, religion, government, think tank, or movement exalts itself as operating from the right moral position in a sea of manipulative garbage, often concealing its own deeper agendas behind the PR, ideological inception, and recruitment campaigns. It is truly tough to conclude much about anything anymore, but we do what we can to whack through the weeds and find our own path despite many misdirections and admittedly some occasional backtracking. Sadly, even many of the countercultures we might have found comfort in often end up having sketchy intelligence ties and unsavory funding that oftentimes leaves one wondering if we bought a lie sold to us as an alternative truth, which is the value I found in the dense and detailed work of today's guest, Matthew Ehret. Matthew is a journalist as well as director of the Rising Tide Foundation, founder of the Canadian Patriot Review, and senior fellow of American University in Moscow. He's super active with very detailed films like the in-progress 8-part series, The Hidden Hand Behind UFOs, impressive Substack articles, and many books, some co-authored with his wife Cynthia Chung, like a 3-volume series titled Revenge of the Mystery Cults, a 4-volume series titled Clash of Two Americas, Breaking Free of Anti-China Psyops, How the Cold War is Being Revived and What You Can Do About It, and Science Unshackled, Restoring Causality in a World of Chaos. The topics covered in Matt's work are vast, but what I consider a uniting theme at the core is that mainstream versus alternative is a dichotomy the elite use to ensnare us just the same as black versus white, left versus right, etc., etc. And we hear many assumed narratives across the conspiracy corpus that Matt suggests were engineered as a second net, aimed at counterculture capture. And that's something any truly open-minded free thinker should at least be able to consider. So let's get in the mood. The dialect deconstructor, sheep class critic, and light bearer in a dark labyrinth of lies. Matt, welcome to the Higherside.
Thank you for having me on, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm looking forward to this chat.
I try, man. Wordy stuff. I don't make it easy on myself, but it is a pleasure. So much to talk about. Largely, I hoped we could squeeze in a lot of the threads in the conspiracy mythos that you pick apart because I find that to be the most unique aspect of your work. It's not that you're against conspiratorial thinking, but it seems like you might say that conspiracy-minded people aren't critical enough of the major alternative narratives within their own subculture, and we forget that a lot of thought goes into crafting false alternatives because they know not everyone's going to trust the mainstream. And that's pretty fair to say, right?
Yeah, that's a very fair thing to say. And I think that you only become qualified to begin to start thinking about causality, our world, our future, what's shaping us, what will be the future. When you take the step out of this kind of hyper-reductionist, normalized materialism that presumes that intentions, ideas do not shape reality. And it's only when you put that in the garbage and you accept the fact, this discoverable fact that conspiracies shape everything and have always shaped everything pertaining to the human condition and will always do so for good or for bad. It's not like conspiracy, and that's part of the thing too. At that point, when you realize that conspiracies, intentions, ideas for what the future should be have been animating people who have had a common way of thinking and agreement about some future outcome, they work towards it, again, for good or for bad. But that doesn't mean just because you acknowledge that there are nefarious conspiracies that you all of a sudden have the master key to understand everything, right? Like you were saying.
Yeah.
What does that mean? We see people who believe in conspiracies who disagree with themselves all the time. It's everywhere. So who controls the narratives of one type, one flavor of conspiracy or another flavor in the buffet that we're being given that gives us a sense of, certainly it feels better. Like there's a sense of solace to know, okay, every group who chose to be in that part of the conspiracy buffet, whether it's the shape-shifting lizard people or the dimensional grays, or the Jew Khazar people who say no, it's all about the Jew Khazars, or there's so many different the Jesuit groups. It's all about the Jesuits. There's partially, I think, an attraction because to their particular variation, because it gives a sense of satisfaction knowing that there's a reason for things. Like the mind yearns for a reason like that. So we don't sit well in uncertainty forever. We need to hold on to, like, why did this happen? Why is there life? Why are bad things happening? Why are wars? Why are assassinations? So that's good, but you don't want to hold on so tight because, again, who's to say that that particular explanation that you've been given, although it's more truthful than the crappy ones of those many who have gone through our mainstream education system, who have been led to believe there is no such purpose to asking even why in anything, whether science or whether history. It's all about, there's pervasive belief in randomness shaping the outcome and the unfolding of events, even the events of nature devoid of the human touch.
Mm-hmm.
We're told, okay, we have to assume that there's random genetic mutations in biology if we want to get a job and be respected and be peer reviewed, and we have to abide by certain sort of modern godheads. Like we have to pay homage to Darwin specifically in his particular randomized model of genetic mutations that give rise to a rolling of the dice idea of mutations causing the weak of any given species to be destroyed as the strong of that species persevere. Or in physics, we're told we have to presume in the absolute fact of randomness, probability theory that presumes that there's just at the very subatomic part level, no causation. Everything is random. An electron could be here or there. And maybe it is in both places, we're told, because string theory and these mathematical models that grew out of Niels Bohr's network of mathematicians have all told us that we have to presume that something is both a wave and a particle, whether it's matter or whether it's light. And it can be both here and there at the same time. And it can be in another universe because there's infinite universes and there's thus infinite things that have existed. And thus there's no point in causality to even go there. So that's just stuff in the mainstream. And we're told as well, like, just why do wars happen? Well, people just got sick of paying taxes to a foreign power, so they did a revolution, and Hitler got kicked out of art school, so he made a war, and Napoleon had a small penis, so he made a war. And it's like, that's the stuff that people actually make careers around in mainstream. So you get out of that and you're like, okay, no, there are Freemasonic agencies, there's secret societies, there's Rosicrucian undergrounds that seem to despise this human quality of problem solving, making creative discoveries into God's creation, applying those to making our lives better, to finding peace with our neighbors, even if they have a different language or a different religion. Our natural human tendency has been historically to find peace, to avoid divide to conquer strategies, to make life better for our kids. And the oligarchy seems to be something which is parasitically latched onto us, which despises that attribute and which works to bring out the worst in us in order to better control divided, dumbed down, underpopulated people. And that's part of the reality of what we're living in. So all that to say, I know I'm going on a long time here now too, but I'll throw it back at you in a second. The issue of what's concerning me right now is a lot of the best people who have woken up, especially COVID kind of shook a lot of people out of their normieism, and they've become, conspiracy theorists with very strong opinions about everything pertaining from medicine, history, science, you name it. Which it's good that people's minds are going into that much wider spectrum. They should do that, but there's a sloppiness as well. Part of that I'm noticing of the sloppiness is a tendency to fall into traps, which I'm seeing, especially amongst the conservative, liberty-minded crowds that are the most equipped to pass judgment on the evil of this type of great reset agenda that we've been nudged towards, over decades. But there is a tendency on the one hand to start seeing that, well, anybody who talked about conspiracies that pertain to, bankers, especially with Jewish names, must be good. So Hitler must be good. And I'm seeing like a very clear revival or of Nazism. You got Kanye West, you got all sorts of Joe Rogan is pumping out, sanitized translations of Hitler's speeches, and it's coming out everywhere. Stu Peters is putting out very, very viral things. And because he's talking about the protocols of Zion, Hitler is a conspiracy theorist. He emerged out of a network of people who were reading things like the protocols of Zion that was being spread in the 1905 to 1920s period, especially in Germany, but also in Russia and in the United States. And if you read the writings of a lot of the conspiracy theorists around that, it looks very similar to what has become very popular today as far as recognizing Freemasonic agencies, banking conspiracies. A lot of it involves the B'nai B'rith and the ADL and other things. But it's also tied to a trap, because Hitler himself, all of these things grew out of the Theosophists, a bunch of Rosicrucian Satanists and Gnostics who were like masquerading as and shaping what would become the basis of the New Age, which then put out these narratives in order to take people who were becoming very suspicious of mainstream establishment sources and nudging them towards a reactionary extreme trap. So that's what they do. They push a far left agenda on the one hand with Bolshevism run amok, and then the same Freemasonic agencies are pushing a right-wing conservative reactionary position that then causes this dialectic to then manifest in the form of things that ultimately kill millions and millions of people. So I'll shut up now.
No,
but those are my considerations.
Yes, that's great. You used a lot of examples that are way off my outline here, but it doesn't really matter. It's true we're attracted to singular narratives, especially in the conspiracy world. You could say the mainstream narrative is like, I can trust all these people in authority, and that's my singular narrative. And probably the opposite in the conspiracy world. And I've done these interviews for 15 years, and I interview people who oftentimes have a singular lane, and it's going to be all about the Jesuits. It's going to be all about this group or that. And I just hear them out, and then I say to the audience, look, maybe I'm too dumb to tell you what to think, but we hear every case, and whoever makes the best case kind of wins the argument, and I'm sure it's a little bit of truth in all these things, but like you say, problem, reaction, solution. They do things one way, and then they bring someone up who says, hey, look what they're doing over here. And then everyone's like, yeah, this guy's actually telling the truth. And then they give you a solution that it is another trap. I have no problem with people re-examining everything they've been told. A lot of your work is about these characters of history that have been crafted and deconstructing their actual biography and saying a lot of that's a lie. So yeah, we have to do everything we can to look at everything we've assumed and then be like, was that a lie, or was there some truth to it? Is it somewhat in the middle? So I don't have a problem with someone re-examining the speeches of Hitler or re-examining some of the stuff that people were attracted to, because you got to re-examine everything. I just don't think we can take anything for granted, but a lot of time you find, well, I shouldn't swing the pendulum completely the other way. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and you have to admit that they're seeding little truths to be extra manipulative to get people back into a different camp. So these are the murky waters we swim in, right? It's tough to see anything clearly. But before we get too deep into the unexpected topics, I wanted to start by giving you a bona fide attaboy for the piece you wrote on Christmas Eve last year, Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, two sides of one magic trick. Now, we've just seen Elon getting inducted into the Black Eye Club, whatever the hell that is. I think there's definitely something to it. And leaving the administration and publicly feuding with Trump. And at the same time, all the headlines come out about Palantir getting the green light to build the big database on all Americans. And it just seems like one tech bro passing the football to another. And this post you wrote way back when really foreshadows what's playing out right now, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, unfortunately, well, that was, and that post that I published was part of a book. It was a chapter of a book that I was working on that's now published and available called Rosicrucian Golem. It's Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Volume 2.
You got a knack for titling things, I will say that.
Thank you. There's actually, I got a copy of it here. If people want to, if they see it online, they want to pick up a copy. It's their Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Volume 2. It's got the Rosicrucian cross there, and you got Isaac Newton, a rotten apple, Nikola Tesla, Charles Darwin, and in shadow in the back there is Elon. And basically the governing theme that I'm trying to sort of weave together is that there is a Rosicrucian magic trick that's been ongoing that ties what's going on right now to the emergence of the Rosicrucians back in 1606 in their official, their more modern form at least. Which gave rise to a ritual mass murder of the world in the form of the 30 Years' War that killed off millions of people, which the Rosicrucians had organized, setting off religious wars that went on for generations in Europe. And how this thing that's tied to John Dee, Bacon, a whole network of people, Paracelsus, Robert Flood, transformed the England into an empire, seeded things like the Invisible College. That's how they organized themselves. They created certain synthetic frontmen or cardboard cutouts. As I go through one example of Isaac Newton, himself a self-professed Rosicrucian.
The Babylonian witch, as you call him in your writings.
Yeah, Babylonian witch. That was John Maynard Keynes, actually, himself.
Oh, there you go.
Part of this Rosicrucian operation in the Fabian Society, who bought up Isaac Newton's chest and said that Isaac Newton actually, when you look at his original works, and John Maynard Keynes was happy about this. He said he was actually not so much the first of the modern scientists, but the last of the Babylonian witches. That's John Maynard Keynes. And again, he was happy about that because he was like, that's his tradition. So that, because all of his original works were alchemy, were numerology, trying to calculate the end times, was Kabbalism. So all that to say, what I try to do in that book, again, I luckily had a lot of researchers that helped me, was map out where are the fallacies, where are the false narratives about what is science? Because there's a whole battle about how the science is the domain where the human mind comes into contact with the mind of God. Like, that's how I see science in the healthy sense. It's like we're looking for the laws of creation. And if we're creative and we have a heart and a mind attuned with passion and love of truth more than our own axioms, then we will be able to self-question and even eliminate by our own free will those false constructs that are withholding our ability to make that leap, that discovery, that eureka. And so those we are told a story about that science today in the worlds that are controlled by oligarchs, that science occurred by people like Sir Isaac Newton, by Rene Descartes, Francis Bacon, or later on Charles Darwin, and there we've got a whole plethora of modern secular gods of the scientific Enlightenment pantheon that we're told were like these great minds. Richard Dawkins in a modern setting is another one, and all that to say. But then when you look at what that is, we're told, well, how did they make those discoveries? Well, the method that all of them promote, or that we're told to abide by, is a form of radical empiricism, a belief in sense certainty, and that the mind must simply use the five senses in a radical form to look for patterns and then extrapolate patterns into universal laws that they then label with symbols that can then be memorized, repeated, and applied, almost like in a monkey-like way by others. And those people can become convinced that they're doing science. Now, I could say, when I actually look at the works of people who made those discoveries, it wasn't Newton. I would say even every single discovery that Newton is attributed for having made as a part of this Rosicrucian Invisible College can be attributed earlier to real continental scientists like Johannes Kepler, like Gottfried Leibniz, like Pierre de Fermat, like Christian Huygens, who are actually making the breakthroughs on the inverse square law, on optics, on everything, on the infinitesimal calculus. So what's happening, and this goes into the running theme, is that there has been a technique to try to steal the fruits of the discoveries made by real integrated human beings. And if you can't destroy science, at least try to co-opt it and repurpose it for your own ends, says the empire, or says any imperialist. And what they've done is they've had a technique that's been sharpened of taking cardboard cutouts that they then will steal new technologies, new innovations, new techniques, new discoveries, big discoveries too, and then repackage them. They will eliminate the soul of the discovery, the method. They will then just give it the shell. They will keep the shell, like the formula that can be memorized, and then they will pass it on in something that can be memorized, like Newton's Principia Mathematica, which is just a compendium it's like an encyclopedia of right answers, but no question of causation. What was he thinking about? What was his experiments? What did he do? What did he do wrong? Nothing of that is there. So that's part of what the oligarchy has been trying to do, to give us a false sense of knowledge of the universe, and then also keep us in a cage. Now, as you alluded to, this Peter Thiel, Elon Musk thing, both characters, when you start scratching on the surface, and the article that came right before that one in the book is Elon Musk and the revival of technocracy 2.0, which basically gets at the theosophical Rosicrucian elements that shaped Elon Musk's grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, who was assigned working very closely with Fabians and Rhodes Scholars in Canada, who set up what was known or led the Canadian branch of Technocracy Inc. to create basically I think at this point it's become more known amongst the type of viewers who watch your show that they were calling for essentially a complete overhaul of mankind, a recrafting of human beings under a scientific a technocratic elite that would involve establishing a centralized control grid with Greenland, all of North America, Mexico, all the way down to Panama as the centralized control system. And Elon Musk has made reference to the technate idea. He's even taken the naming procedures that the technate of his grandfather had promoted, which was that you have to, if you want to be a member of this new society, and all members of Technocracy Inc. had to give up their names, or at least substitute their names for a series of numbers and X's. So Joshua Haldeman's name was like X235X2. And we could see that Elon Musk has even like given a little bit of an homage to that for one of his probably, test tube kids. I say probably, I don't know, but probably. And has given direct, explicit lip service to Technocracy Inc. as something that he believes should be the basis of his vision for Mars colonization, calling for a Martian technate, other things. So if you trace out the lineage and of Elon Musk as a personality, both as he was promoted as a great genius who sort of was self-generated as a great genius and the richest man in the world, proves that he must be the most brilliant mind, and who's got all of these patents, technological patents associated to his name. A lot of it is very reminiscent of the type of approach that was used to craft the figure of Isaac Newton 4 centuries earlier. Isaac Newton, who himself could never publicly defend he was never allowed to go into an uncontrolled setting where people would challenge his so-called discoveries because he couldn't put them into words. He was a member of parliament. He was a very powerful figure. He was made the master of the mint of the Bank of England. So he's given a lot of political power, but he would never said anything on record in the parliament. He was only known for getting his rocks off, passing the death sentence for anybody who is like counterfeiting. And he always wanted to watch the torture and the murder of the people in England who were like passing on counterfeit coins. So Newton was a sociopath. Again, he was into occultism in secret, and then being passed off like he was this great empiricist scientist. And I think Elon Musk, he's never allowed to be in an uncontrolled environment where people are authentically challenging him. He cannot and many expert software engineers who really know their stuff have listened to him try to describe the software that we're told he invented and the patents he owns, and he can't do it. Right. So he's clearly got handlers and is clearly mostly a branding projection.
He falls apart just in a 2-hour podcast interview with someone who's kind of on his side. He just doesn't come off as all that intelligent. It is a facade. Like, I like the cardboard cutout analogy. And we've deconstructed the Royal Society and had a lot of criticisms of all of its members and its various branches. I mean, anthropology, history itself, all the different types of sciences, and how the mainstream worldview has kind of been crafted. But what's so interesting about your work is you also go after that alternative. And you held up the book cover. Obviously, Tesla's on that book. It is interesting that Musk got this counterculture credibility by using the Tesla name when his car company first came out. People are like, oh, this guy, he gets it. He knows the alternative stuff. Well, in this 9-part series on Tesla, you talk about a lot of the myth making. And to quote part 1, you write, was Nikola Tesla a great genius ahead of his time as a modern prophet or electrical wizard, as some have called him? Or is there evidence that something much more insidious was afoot? An image has been passed down to us of a renegade genius misunderstood by those living in his era, constantly financially attacked by the evil financiers who preferred to support the unscrupulous Thomas Edison or Marconi, leaving him poor, digging ditches for food, and selling his futuristic patents for money, but is any of this actually true? My contention is that scratching at the carefully crafted official narrative of Tesla's life and works, extremely dark forces are soon found lurking under the shiny surface, which should not be ignored. And I love having assumptions challenged. My whole paradigm has kind of been like, well, look, the oligarchs and the robber barons, they kind of crafted the mainstream science around meterable, controllable things. Let's make sure electricity is metered and wired and not abundant, and we can charge for it. Oil, same thing. And then the alternative world suggests that there is a lot of stuff out there that's been cut around, like the ether and ether-based physics and anti-gravitic, electrogravitic technologies. And a lot of that whole worldview goes a lot deeper than just Tesla. It doesn't come out of just one guy. I mean, there's Wilhelm Reich, there's Victor Schauberger, who looked at nature and saw vortexes and other things. There's T. Townsend Brown. There's more modern people like Christopher Hitchinson, who is a Canadian who used to film levitation on YouTube and then died suddenly. There's Stanley Myers, who got cars to run on water and also got killed. So I'm kind of in this box of thinking that there is a lot of more abundant and free-flowing technologies that have been suppressed. But you seem to write about ether in a negative sense, like that's a bunk thing. At least that's the vibe I get from what you've written. But talk to us about a better way, the correct way to think about the alternative science world and a figure like Tesla.
Yeah, sure. Well, I would say a lot of this stuff, like science is fake. Like most of the science we've been given, we can all agree, is mostly fake make-believe narratives that are keeping us from actually discovering the laws of the universe, but still giving us an arrogant sense of self-satisfaction. If you're an academician in university, or you're getting research grants, you've got a false sense of arrogance that yes, of course we know exactly what's inside the sun. Look at these graphs, and we know that in the side of the Earth you've got this much mantle and this much core, and we know exactly how that works. It's clearly, and then we know exactly the Big Bang. We to the millionth of a second of a picosecond. We know exactly 13.7256 billion years ago was the Big Bang, and before that there was nothing, and then after that we're going to go to a heat death, after which there will be ultimately nothing. So of course we know, and the arrogance is astounding, right? It's sickening, but it's the consequence of what the oligarchy wants, because we lose the passion to seek the unknown when we think we know it all. Like why? If anything, we'll feel threatened. If a student asks a good question, the teacher will, if they're of that rigid mindset, become even angry that the student is asking a question that they don't know the answer to already, and they'll typically instinctually attack. So that's useful for an oligarchy. But what are they suppressing? Like I made reference to how Isaac Newton's discoveries can be attributed. If people look at the original works of, like, look for the origins of the ideas, like those ideas attributed to Newton came decades, in some cases, like in the case of Kepler, a generation before Newton was even born. Kepler was discovering gravity. How was he discovering gravity? He didn't like the inverse square laws there in Kepler's works published in 1619. He's discovering it by the harmonics. So he's looking at Pythagorean harmonics and doing it intelligibly. You could read all of Kepler's writings that have survived, like his Harmonies of the World, where his third planetary law of motion is expounded upon, where he discovers provably that the reason for the planetary orbits, because he's asking the question, why are the orbits that are knowable located in the positions that they're located in and not some other possible set of configurations? But we find them in these certain configurations. Why that and not some other? And his hypothesis he takes from Plato's Timaeus, which Plato's Timaeus first lays out this hypothesis from the Pythagoreans that there is a geometric harmonic beauty and a coherent ordering, right, of the planets that ties into the Platonic solids and the nesting of the 5 Platonic solids, the dodecahedron, icosahedron, octahedron, cube, and tetrahedron. So there's a lawful way of nesting them that gives you certain proportions. But the data empirically was not available in the time of Plato to actually pursue that to make a discovery fully. But the hypothesis was a potent one. St. Augustine even explores that in the last 3 chapters of his unabridged Confessions. And this is like a big idea. Da Vinci is even looking into the question of the dodecahedron and its relationship to nature, to life, to the cosmos. So Kepler actually proves it. He takes it, and he's got enough data for the first time to actually take that hypothesis and then demonstrate that there is a musical, coherent ordering, and that tempers the behavior of all of the planets around the sun. And that has huge geopolitical implications, because that means if the universe is organized in a harmonious way by a composer creator, which is coherent to the mind of the mortals, and he's not part of a ruling family, he's not part of a noble Rosicrucian bloodline or something. He's just a human being from like a lowborn, but who is able to make this incredible discovery and then translate that into words that were intelligible. That means that the entire way that society has permitted itself to be organized has been completely wrong. And he's very coherent about that in his writings. Now, when you actually look at the breakthroughs made by the big breakthroughs made in science in all of the subsequent years coming after, and by the way, Kepler is citing Leonardo da Vinci's work on the golden section, Luca Pacioli's work on the golden section, which happened a generation earlier than Kepler. So there's a direct continuity of this unbroken continuity between the Pythagorean Platonic school that was also fighting to create a new type of society that would be premised around natural law and a true harmony founded upon the sacredness of individual liberty, at the same time as the individual is matured to realize that their freedoms are are tied directly into their duty. That's the conception of the philosopher king notion developed by Plato, and that was sort of carried forth. So Leibniz, who discovers the infinitesimal calculus, is not just doing mathematics. These are ideas that are ripped off and then we're told are tied to Isaac Newton. It's not true. He's looking at Kepler's works. He's looking at the nonlinear changes in physical space-time. They're looking at the integration of space, matter, and time already. All of these potent thinkers are doing that, and they think of space as a saturated thing. They're all battling the empty space idea of Euclid, of Newton, who presumed that there's such a thing as empty space with self-existent matter just floating around, pushing and pulling on itself through mysterious forces in absolute time. So all of these figures like Leibniz, like Kepler, like the Bernoulli brothers, who are making great discoveries on nonlinear physical space-time, later on Gauss, later on Riemann, they later on, which is cited by Einstein as the foundation for this idea of a Riemannian physical space-time that has curvature, that has saturation. Max Planck's work on the quantum is directly tied into this. Max Planck is studying Kepler and setting Kepler, stating to these new generation of physicists that if you want to understand science, you have to read Kepler, and nobody's listening to him. They call him the crazy old man who doesn't believe in the new discoveries of randomness, as if that's a new discovery. But the people who are making the discoveries that form the foundation of the best breakthroughs, including the work in they recognize that there is some form of an ether, that there's a shape to space, and that includes Einstein. As I get it in chapter 6 of this book, Einstein actually was defending, he had an idea of an ether, but it wasn't the type of idea of the ether that was promoted then by the networks of the occultists and Rosicrucians, then circling around the figure of Thomas Huxley, who was the grandfather of Aldous and Julian, and the handler of Charles Darwin at the Invisible College in England at that time. So they had an idea of an ether that was based upon an occult idea that there are angels and demons and other entities and elementals. That's sort of the Gnostic idea that exist in this other domain that we can channel. And so a lot of these guys are utilizing sort of Delphic channelers as part of their operation for themselves. You know, people like Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton, who's also part of this whole Rosicrucian revival apparatus, very closely tied to Thomas Huxley. They're using channelers. They're trying to invoke demonology. They're trying to talk to the dead. They're doing necromancy in that sense. And so part of the idea of that version, that sick idea of the ether, is that there are all of these demon forces, dead ghosts that we can like interface with if we are adept and gnostically sort of initiated, that's driving the world insane. And you've got an attempt to try to validate scientifically that notion of the occult ether through the veneer of science, and people who were mentors of a young Nikola Tesla. I was surprised to discover, but I guess, increasingly less and less surprised the more I looked into it, were people like William Crookes, Sir William Crookes, who's known as like this great, mathematician, technologist, scientist. He was the president of the British Royal Society for a few years. He was also the president of the uh, Psychical Society, the British
Society for Psychical Research.
Society for Psychical. Thank you. He's the president of that at the same time, and he was the mentor of Tesla. They write lifelong course, or not lifelong, but for many, many years in the 1890s, they're writing correspondences. Tesla's calling him my mentor. Crookes is he's helping to promote the spiritualist religion to overthrow Christianity as a whole in his position as this scientist. And he is stealing ideas of other scientists. There's actually a number of real scientists who he's ripping off, saying his ideas are his own. And then he's redefining what's going on within his Crookes devices, Crookes tubes, that he's then saying, okay, what's going on when you're looking at these plasmas is actually, ghostly forces tied to our dead loved ones and relatives. And he's helping to create fraudulent mediums and supporting these fraudulent mediums who are discovered to be fraudulent. But he's trying to use his authority to pass this off. So this is what Tesla is being shaped by. And Tesla ends up playing also a big role in a lot of this too, promoting the idea that machines that he's being given and being told are things he's patented, like little machines that are automated. His teleautomaton is a big one. He's circulating it across the United States in the 1890s, acting like it's a self-thinking machine that's solving problems that he's asking his audience. It's kind of like a P.T. Barnum skit.
Mm-hmm.
And he's asking his audiences to go and pose questions to this machine, this teleautomata, but only mathematical questions. And it'll solve all of the questions for you. And using a bunch of lights, it answers questions. And the audience is flipping out. And he's telling them that it's doing this because he's telepathically communicating to this thing through the power of his very adept mind and neck muscles that he says is allowing him to transmit his will into the machine to answer for him. It's not true, actually. It turns out these things are being run by one of his assistants hidden in the background with a little device controlling the buttons. So he's part of this magic trick, and that kind of got me. So I'm seeing, so I'll wrap it up here this way. There's this beautiful set of discoveries throughout the 20th century from people like Christian Birkeland, who is part of the Keplerian harmonious plasma-based worldview that creates the foundation of a lot of what became in our more recent days known as the electric universe, model of, which is, I would say, the more correct model than anything available otherwise.
Good.
But it's infused Christian Birkeland, who was looking at plasmas in the real sense, and Birkeland currents, which are truly founding like the relationship of all of the planets to the sun as electric currents, as electric circuits moving through plasma, and every sun within our galaxy as interconnected within a very saturated domain. All of the great discoveries, I think, were happening through that current. But the oligarchy has done two things. They've tried to, I think they killed Christian Birkeland, first of all. But they tried to steal those discoveries so that they could then use them for their own purpose, to repurpose them and then use them at their choice, not to uplift people to a better way, but to enslave us. And on the other hand, if they can't completely subvert people's appreciation for this tradition, what they can do is they can infuse crazy into it, infuse it with occultism so that we fall off the path of this tradition, so that there's people like herself, a Rosicrucian, Frances Yates, whose book I'm reading right now called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. It's from the Warburg Institute, by the way, that published this thing in the 70s. She's lying all over the place. She's trying to say that Kepler's a Rosicrucian, Leibniz is a Rosicrucian, everybody's a Rosicrucian. Everything good came out of people doing black magic. And so that's what they do. They're like, and so they create these new little mystical narratives.
Right.
And I'll end it there, I guess. But that's sort of my way of approaching that very difficult question that you threw at me.
No, it's all great. You are a really good speaker. You've clearly done a lot of research into all this stuff. And I have this lengthy outline. We're only on page 2 of a 7 page outline. Clearly, I'm looking at the time. We're not really going to get to everything, but you kind of did say overthrowing Christianity. And this is kind of where, like I said earlier, I interview a lot of people. They have their own perspectives on all of this murky stuff. And yours seems to be Christianity. Like that seems to be your true north. I'm getting the sense that if it isn't Christian, then it's in the bad category. And I guess I feel like you lump in a lot of things as occult or negative that I wouldn't put in that context. Not all. I mean, things get used. Like let's MK Ultra. You know, you talk about MK Ultra, you talk about psychedelic studies. Yes, but I think you kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater there, because even though psychedelics were used in MK Ultra and they were weaponized and they were even propagated in the culture of the 60s and all that, some of them are natural. And some of them, I think, you know, like mushrooms, I think have a real spiritual purpose. I think if you get outside of the small sliver of Western culture using them, trying to find a truth serum or weaponize them, there's a robust global usage of these things for a natural spirituality. I think if we're getting to the laws of nature, like this is a natural thing that opens up consciousness. And this is just one example, but you're hard on SRI and remote viewing. You're hard on a lot of this stuff that I would say psi effects. You know, it seems like you doubt all this stuff is even possible, or channeling. Like, yes, there's a lot of fraud in channeling and mediumship, but I also think there is direct downloads from something of a spiritual nature that some people occasionally get. I know your series about the hidden hand behind UFOs goes really deep into the manipulations there with government intelligence and Rosicrucians. It's really well done. But I think you don't give much attention to the wide range of strange, bizarre experiences people do report to have with something. From your Christian perspective, is that demons? Is it all fabricated? Like that's kind of where I have a hard time really grappling with the wider worldview of how much credibility you give to some of these other things. The Sibyls, another example. You refer to the Sibyls as women who were raped by the priesthood and filled up with drugs and then thrown in a cave to babble. And it seems like you don't put any credibility in the actual prophecies of the Sibyls. That's okay. I could see a adjacent thing to MK Ultra, abusing kids to get them in exotic states of consciousness to try to extract some kind of information from the wider reality. Like there's a parallel between the way you describe the Sibyls with the language I just used and what MK Ultra was doing to kids. So I'm trying to, stumble through a summary of what I expected to get through over the course of 2 hours, because I just want to get the overview that you think all these alternative things, you kind of just seem to think they're all bullshit.
Well, I don't know if, here, there's a lot of elements that you raised there.
I know, I had to, sorry.
No, but I do it too, right? Like I throw so much at you as well. So it's that, yeah. So what I would say for the first up, my position, metaphysical position, personally speaking, if you were to ask me, like, what do I categorize myself most as? I'd primarily say probably a Platonist. That's probably what I would do. I'm very sympathetic to Ben Franklin. Like I've read a lot of Ben Franklin's works.
Oh no, Hellfire Club.
Yeah. No, I studied
the
all of Ben
bodies under
Franklin's
his
work.
house.
Nah, they made that up. They made that up.
See?
Yeah,
See?
that's what they do.
Well, you even think the Nag Hammadi texts were a forgery, which,
No, I don't think it's a forgery. I think it's a coming out party. I think that those texts weren't discovered in 1946. I think that they were already known, but after World War II, as a new onslaught to prepare for a new great reset, was like a new reset of all of the human condition was being put into motion, and all of the Nazis were being sort of given new assignments to run NATO and the global secret army apparatus and stuff. If people don't know about that, I'm sorry for you people who've not looked into that. But at the same time as that whole new plan was being brought online, I think that the decision was made at that moment to release them to the public as a bit of a coming out party, with a bit of a story around a Muhammad Ali murderer on the run from the law who found himself in a cave and discovered all of these texts that then were very quickly translated under um, the management of Carl Jung and the Carl Jung Institute.
And you put Carl
which,
Jung in the category of like part
oh
of
yeah,
the milieu of the bad
oh
guys.
yeah, oh yeah,
See, that
yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's
yeah.
what's so surprising to people. You put Tesla, Rudolf Steiner, and Carl Jung in this group as Rosicrucians that are manipulating the alternative. You even go so far at one point to draw some connections between Tesla and Crowley. We've covered Crowley as
Yeah.
a British spy before, but not to this degree, where you suggest that Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, funded by J.P. Morgan, of course, a red flag, might have been a way that Crowley reported back. And you say there's a report from U.S. Office of Navy Intelligence dated July 10th, 1917, that zeroed in on Theodore Rouse, Crowley's fellow leader in the Rosicrucian OTO. I don't ever hear the OTO described as Rosicrucian, but they stated that Crowley maintained some mysterious means of communication with their chief in Berlin, Rudolf Steiner. So I don't ever hear these threads connected. And that's what makes me think, like, am I talking to someone who comes from this Christian perspective that says Gnosticism bad, Rosicrucianism bad? I mean, I don't know. I don't necessarily have a dog in the fight, but I just never hear these things tied in together. And it seems like that's kind of
Yeah.
unique to you.
Thanks, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Okay.
I look for unique perspectives. That's why you're here.
Yeah,
But
I try. So okay, look. So yeah, getting back to the thing. So my position being somebody who abides by, and I was mentioning Ben Franklin. So when Ben Franklin was asked like, what's your position? What's your religion? What's your philosophy? He's like, I follow Confucius, Socrates, and Jesus. Right. So the point being is I'm looking at the life. He's looking at the life of how they self-organized their minds and their messaging to make the world a better place and to understand creation. And Socrates, Confucius, and Jesus, I think, are pretty solid people. I'm very sympathetic to that way of thinking. So I'm always looking for, like, my core elements to my faith is that there is a creator that created the universe with reason and is not a dead creator that just made rules that must be followed, but is a present living creator that's present at all times, at all places, creating, and that we are thus co-creating, potentially, if we choose to, with that creator, if we're developing our minds and our aesthetical sensibilities according to in some way which is in conformity with the laws, natural law, so-called, the way it's developed by St. Augustine, for example, or Confucius within his Analects, or Mencius within his golden his doctrine of the mean, for example. So I do have a sort of, I'm looking for the universal attributes, the simple attributes that different cultures have tapped into at different times that allows us to discover God's creation and change our behavior through our own desires and our own will in emulation with those discovered hidden laws.
let me just jump in to say, broadly speaking, that's my worldview too. I agree with that. I just think when we get into the little nuances, the details, you put things in kind of a nefarious category that I don't think are necessarily nefarious. I mean, God made the Amanita muscaria mushroom. I guess I just wonder what you think about. I would think you're gonna try to tell me that all psychedelic mushrooms are made by the CIA or something, because they made LSD.
No. My position on that, on the question of psychedelics, is simply that everything has to be done with. You don't want to skip steps in developing your methods and your research and anything. Like you're not going to get a kid who's in grade 3 to go and just immediately do work that is expected of somebody in grade 10. Oftentimes, I think that what we are dealing with is a lot of people have been victimized in ways they don't understand by a culture that's withheld from them because we live in an oligarchical system, right? That's the name. So we've been withheld from our ability to even just understand how our mind works in a healthy, creative state, in just a natural, creative, reasonable state where reason and creative spontaneity coexist at the same time, in a healthy way. So we've been cut off. All of that history. That's kind of why I went through that work, that brief sketch about this history of science that's been cut off by this invisible college operation that's been creating, on the one hand, a radical empiricist doctrine, and on the other hand, um, a hyper mystical Gnostic doctrine that is a very an apparent opposition to the radical empiricism that they ironically promote for the public, but then they have something else for the initiated higher elite who recognize the limitations of Cartesianism, Newtonianism, and want to go in the opposite direction and want to find something more healthy. So they have something for the initiates as well to jump into. I'm saying that there's another current that's been cut off from us, which is tied to neither one of those two extremes, but is founded upon a coherent, continuous school of thought that ties the sciences and the arts and political freedom together, that have co-evolved together by people who often get assassinated by these entities, by these agencies over the millennia. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if it comes to most people that I encounter in our culture today who talk about all of the explorations with psychedelics that they have had, they haven't they're skipping steps. They haven't taken their time to understand how this beautiful instrument of the mind works in a straight manner before they go off and are trying to discover alternate universes and channel and speak to other entities and stuff through the assistance of naturally occurring products from nature. And I'm not saying that it should never be done. I'm just saying it's being done in such a disjointed way that it's not making people better or more capable of actually combating this oligarchical beast that wants to kill us all in a big extermination that's going to happen pretty soon if we don't change our paradigm, because they're going to get their 95% population kill off if we don't really think very differently about what they are and how they operate and how they get us to self-control in our own worlds, you know?
Okay,
So
that's
part
fair
of
to
my
say.
thing.
That's fair to say, but we can't control what other people think, and we're never going to get everybody to agree. People are so brainwashed. I gave up on that a long time ago in terms of if we can only just get everybody to think X, if we can only get everybody to fight this, then we can topple them. I don't know.
No, I don't mean that at all. I just mean the idea of people who learn how their minds are supposed to work. There's no
No.
formula for that.
Yeah, I was
you
just
know? I
commenting on that last part you said,
Yeah.
but it seems like if
Oh.
I were to lump all the alternative things that I mentioned earlier into one basket, it would be extended consciousness or altered states of consciousness. Yes, the CIA explored this stuff, but a lot of other people outside of the CIA have explored altered states. It seems like you are kind of just generally down on altered states of consciousness. I don't think do you think there's actually value in exploring altered states of consciousness? Do you think that precognition is a thing? Is remote viewing real? I mean, I've done a remote viewing experiment that worked. I don't think it's satanic.
No, I'm not. I wouldn't say. I think it's the question of how do we define this? It's like the ether question, right? When I mentioned that Einstein and Planck believe also in the ether, it doesn't mean, because we've been told that you have to be either one extreme or the other. You believe in empty space or you believe in the ether. We're given these dichotomies, but they actually, when you actually look at it, believed in an ether. It just didn't fall into the category of what's being promoted as the ether today. So I think the same thing goes in my mind for altered states. Like if you look at the creative flow, like when you're in the zone, whether you're an artist, a musician, an actor, you're really giving yourself entirely to not your ego. You're putting yourself into the flow of the spirit of the music that you're performing, or of the performance that you're performing, if you're doing it authentically and honestly. And space and time change. You even see it in sports. People talk about being in the zone, and physical space time is just, or space time in general, is just totally condensed when you're in that creative flow state. So in that sense, like, yeah, I'm totally a big fan of that type of category of altered states.
They usually call it the flow state. Like that's one aspect.
That's one
of it.
example. The
Yeah.
zone is another example. There's numbers of many words that have been given to that state over the over the millennia. But again, the question is, in my mind, is it based upon the abandonment of our reason? Do we completely lose ourselves entirely? Is there nothing of us and the I left in the flow state? Is it totally other, or is there some harmonious balance that can exist of the two, where you're both the other and the self at the same time, and also reasonable as well as creative at the same time, like using reason, but that's not rigid logic, but a more healthy creative reason at the same time, as you're not abandoning the use of that quality. And I've noticed that a lot of the discussion of altered states that come out of the Esalen Institute that are being advanced in our current culture are based upon the abandonment of the use of reason and the abandonment completely, or the attempt to abandon the use of, or the access to ego or the I, whatever you want to call it. And that is, I think, an error. I don't think that that's the healthiest approach to the altered state experience that we have available to us.
Fair enough. Like, yeah, there's definitely a lot of little nuances here. Esalen, a lot of people are critical of Esalen. The whole New Age movement seemed to be like hippies 2.0, spinning people off into a cul-de-sac of nothing. Like, there's not much there. I think I just think you're throwing out a lot of good with the bad, and it's hard to speak so broadly, but like, let's throw in the Society of Cincinnati, for example. I read your book about Poe. I have had a previous guest talk about him as part of a network that was trying to create an American mythos with his work, and not a bad thing. But then post-death, the biographers were all anti-Poe people who kind of crafted this narrative that he was poor and a degenerate, when really he was part of an elite network that you talk about. And I guess elaborate on how you see Poe a little bit, and the Society of Cincinnati, because usually the Society of Cincinnati is framed to me as a negative group. You say they were America's Renaissance intelligence agency, and that's just a real flip on what I usually hear, because apparently I'm usually reading that the Society of Cincinnati is like a modern day Knights Templar, and that their membership is the bloodlines of the original members of the officers of George Washington's army, and that they have been the ones to select most of the major presidents, not the Freemasons. It's this little subsect of the Society of Cincinnati. Obviously, it's a tangled web. I just want to try to straighten some of it out.
It's not a straight, like, there's no straight simple answer to that, because it's nuanced. Like you said, there's tons of bad guys, and Ben Franklin really didn't like the idea of the Society of Cincinnati. He even said, like, this is like setting up the stage for our future self-destruction if we allow for some form of hereditary entity to exist. Like, that's the purpose of America, to break free and to reject hereditary institutions. George Washington thought differently, and he was like, no, we can keep it going. We can keep the conspiracy alive more effectively that way. Unfortunately, over the subsequent generations, I think in the first and second generation of the society, there were many more noble, good people who actually had a direct connection to the fight of the American Revolution, of which David Poe, Edgar Allan Poe's grandfather, was a leading member of that. But by the third generation, it got really bad. It started tanking the other direction, and the more, the typical arrogance and elitism did start taking over increasingly. And you had, the agencies of of destruction, who did ultimately become the vanguard of the Eastern establishment, blue bloods, that ended up dominating the society. And so I don't think by the 1840s that there was much good left in that Society of Cincinnati, or maybe the 1850s. There was a little bit that was twinkling, a little bit here and there, but mostly it was getting pretty rotten, which, again, I think Ben Franklin was correct. It shouldn't have been a hereditary thing, totally. But at the same time as I say that, in the 1815, from 1812 to 1840, there was a much more prevalent role that was played by figures within that organization, of which Poe was a member, and Samuel B. Morse was an associate member. Cooper was another one. The writer, the author. They were also people who were, when you read their writings, they're really exposing the nature of the oligarchical operations inside of America. They're really doing it in a number of ways. The Bravo by Cooper goes through the Venetian intelligence apparatus, how it works to undermine target republics. Cooper's Edgar Allan Poe's collected works. I don't know how he's creating necessarily a mythos around the greatness of America from the writings. I mean, I've read most of Poe's writings. I don't know too much. Maybe the short story on Astoria, perhaps, but I'm not too sure what else it would have been. Cooper definitely was doing that. But no, I think Poe, when you do take in the writings and you look at his role trying to fight this, and it was a Rosicrucian takeover of American Freemasonic lodges, he's exposing a lot of the tricks and the techniques of this thing that was overseeing them. And you read the book. Okay, so if you read the book on Edgar Poe's Final Mystery, I get it. Some ritual murders of like his somebody who appears to be his friend and ally, Mary Rogers, who was ritualistically murdered outside of Sybil's Cave in Hoboken, New Jersey.
Yes.
And it was a ritual murder that was done, as well as her fiance, who was also murdered in the same location 2 months later, who were tied to the Poe networks, who were trying to resist this complete transformation of America from the ideals of its founding republic into an agency of murder, death, and empire. So yeah, no, Poe plays a very, very big, important role in my story, in my research, and I think in American history that people have not yet come to realize. And I'd be curious, who was your guest that was speaking about Poe?
Court Lindahl. He wrote about the Arcadian mysteries, and he has a section of his book. It's been a few years, but it always stuck out to me because I never hear anyone talk about Poe. And he referred to, I think, the network as just a writer's guild. He was a little broad with his description, but American mythos might be, my word for it, my term for it, but it didn't seem like a negative thing the way he was presenting it. It was just like, here's the new America. People like stories. The universe runs on narrative, Terence McKenna said. So it was kind of in that spirit. But you refer to him as a patriot and leading member of America's intelligentsia engaged in a full epistemological war with the darkest forces of the oligarchy's occult societies. And then, yes, let's talk about the Sybil's Cave, because I find this really interesting. We don't have to go too deep on Mary Rogers. It's such a specific murder, but you write, Rogers' gruesome 1840 murder at the site of the newly built Sybil's Cave in New Jersey was actually part of a much larger occult takeover of the U.S., and you go into the history of the Sybils and the Cumaean Sybil. You say this is one of the ones that's lesser known, but was housed in a cave in Naples above thousands of subterranean tunnels built during the Roman Empire, which were also used for initiation rituals that haven't been fully disclosed to this day. You talk about the Well of Souls, saying, additionally, below the Well of Souls is another small cave, which 19th century occultist Orientalist Sir Richard Francis Burton explored and professed to have secretly excavated, having discovered a network of tunnels which he hypothesized served to transport the blood of the victims of mass sacrifices of early pagan periods. Burton hypothesized that this network of tunnels transported the blood of sacrifices into the soil of the region surrounding the temple. And then you go further, saying that the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem has caves underneath it. And
that is the that room that you're talking about, of that particular thing that you were just reading,
the Well of Souls
is under the Dome of the Rock. Yeah, the Well of Souls.
Okay,
that's under the Dome of the Rock today. Yeah,
fair. And it seems like you're basically saying there was this tradition, and it all involves the Sybils and caves and sacrifice. Tie this up for us, and as a backdrop for why the Sybils Cave in New Jersey was even constructed.
Oh, there's a lot that I'm triangulating into, because there's no smoking gun about why it was constructed per se. The Stevens clan, the Stevens family, was a major dominant family that took control after a war with. Oh, I didn't take out my notes here, but so there's a faction of nation builders around Benjamin Franklin, who are Fulton is one of the Fulton steam engine is one of the characters who's working with the Ben Franklin networks of scientists, statesmen, making big innovations, especially on locomotives and steam. The idea of bending space-time is a big idea within this school of Ben Franklin's world, through the application of new discoveries of God's laws into new technologies that allow us to leap over the limits to growth, condense space, and the idea of like what is time, what is distance, what is far, what is close, what is long, what is short, is being shaped and tempered by these discoveries. So, walking or taking a horse versus taking a steam engine or a train is a different experience completely, right? And they were very, very they were reading into the philosophy of science in a much more deep way than people realize. Anyway, I'm saying this because Fulton was at war with this other network that was tied to the Aaron Burr networks, who were in the midst of creating things like Wall Street. You know, like Wall Street itself grew out of a Burr operation in 1798 to establish a sort of a fifth column for the City of London and the Bank of England in America, sort of a stronghold of monetarist finance that would be able to infiltrate and then undo what had happened in 1776 from within. So that was part of what that thing became. Now, Burr created a machinery called Tammany Hall in New York. That was sort of his base of operations. Tammany Hall became sort of the foundation for much of the organizing structures around the Eastern establishment, what are known as the Boston Brahmins, the Eastern establishment families, the local oligarchy of America, of which the Stevens clan was a leading member of that grouping. The what's his name, Russell, the guy who founded Skull and Bones in New Jersey, was also a leading, grouping of that were trying to always create this restoration of an Anglo-American global empire. These are the groups that made their fortunes off the opium trade and opium wars with China in the 1820s and 30s and earlier. So you had these two different factions. Now, Fulton dies a mysterious death. The patent office that registers all of the patents burns to the ground in 1830. So you have this weird transference of discoveries and patents that had been registered by people who were real scientists all of a sudden appear in the ownership of people like the Stevens clan, who all of a sudden Stevens, were told, is the owner of all these patents out of, and he's the guy who invented the steam engine, and he's the guy who did all of these things, and he takes control of all of the shipping between on the Hudson River. So he's got some weird pedigree and weird connections that I can only hypothesize, because again, they don't make public their thoughts,
Sure.
But there's weird shit, and he then has this idea with his son to set up these two things in New Jersey, which become tourist attractions, called the Sibyl's Cave, with a Gothic sort of entrance, and there's a certain spring under this natural cave that they sell as potent spiritualized water for people coming in. And they have right next to it, he builds what are known as the Elysian Fields. Again, very beautiful when you see the pictures of these things. They've recently rehabilitated and reopened this site for tourism after a century of it laying fallow, which is a bit weird. I don't know exactly all the details, but when I looked into what are they referencing, it wasn't even the Cumaean Sibyl that was being referenced with the Sibyl's Cave and the Elysian Fields. It's specifically the Apennine Sibyl, the 11th so-called Sibyl, which I feature in a couple of chapters in that book, was a center in the medieval times especially, but it was also known during the Roman Empire as a zone where there were several emperors and generals that went to receive channeled messages from the Apennine Sibyl in just above Nursia, which is the hometown of Benedict. Benedict and his twin sister Scholastica, who were two members of the Roman patrician class, and who created the Benedictine order and the other order of the sacred nuns, that was Saint Scholastica, who have this weird thing again where this order seemed to have seeded the Knights Templar as well as the Knights Hospitaller during the Crusades to oversee the crusades that would be unleashed onto the world at the end of the 11th century. So you have this town right below Nursia, and in the Apennine Mountains, you have this Sibyl and this cave, which has these inscriptions like 1340, which is the supposed birth date of Christian Rosenkreutz, who doesn't really exist as a person. It's a fictitious character, but that's the sort of number that's still inscripted on the Apennine Sibyl's Cave. Right below it is the Elysian Fields, which is a reference to the Aeneid, which is a reference to a certain place in Hades, where the heroes get to live out in hedonism for eternity, sort of hedonistic bliss. And it was known when I went to the main website of the Apennine, because you can go as a tourist and go to the Apennine Mountain. The cave caved in like 1960 after a big earthquake, so you can't go into the cave anymore. Strangely enough, it's hard to find any photographs, even because there was photography. I would imagine it's out there, but I couldn't find anything through internet searches. it is known that it has been registered by people who've gone into it, that there is a lot of tunneling and networks below it. They note on their tourist website that this was a zone for black mass, for different types of rituals. And they say, there was white magic and black magic, but it was a safe haven for the Cathars, for Templars after they had been persecuted, for global, witchery, but also there was good magic mostly. And they try to like sort of balance it, but they acknowledge that this was like a zone which of occultism, for good or for bad, whatever your opinion is about that, that's acknowledged by their own official websites. And it was excommunicated by Pius II, Piccolomini, who was a leading patron of the Renaissance in opposition to the Neoplatonic Hermetic takeover that was then moving pretty fast. And they were excommunicated as an entire region during 1450s with the help of another guy, Nicholas of Cusa. So there's a fight, and I'm just trying to like lay out and make transparent the nature of the battleground as much as I can between factions who are actually trying to resist the oligarchy effectively versus those who are playing a role for the oligarchy to continue to manage the human herd.
Yes. Now that is well said. That is obviously the crux of what we're trying to do here. In the intro, I basically laid out like it's really hard to sort through this stuff because nobody positions themselves as the bad guy. Nobody wears the sign that says, I'm one of the elite. I'm trying to screw up everything. So you have endless groups and governments and religions all saying that they're the good guy fighting the forces of evil. And it's just so confusing, like, especially when I hear some of your takes that are just really unique. I know I haven't spoken very eloquently today because I just have so many thoughts. It's hard to know what we're going to be able to fit in. But you even have a section in the Poe book titled The Real Magic Behind the Vesica Pisces and the Occult Perversion of Sacred Geometry. And you mentioned the white and black magic thing. And I'm curious if you think there even can be a white magic, because it just seems like, dichotomies, Christian, pagan. That's obviously a dichotomy that's been in existence throughout history. Pagan is considered bad, savage, barbaric, and dark. But yeah, I look at like the legacy of the Druids, which were basically eliminated. And I look at a lot of indigenous spiritualities, and I see people embedded in nature using natural tools of extended consciousness to solve in their own way the mysteries of why we are here, what life even is. The near-death experience, that is something that triggers when people have, obviously, a near-death experience. It's not something done intentionally, but it gives you a breakthrough, like psychedelics, to sense the larger the material world. And I find that to be a gift. And I know you might be cringing because I'm kind of promoting Gnosticism here. Gnosticism is all about this like breaking through the material veil to sense a larger reality, that this is somewhat limiting. The five senses are a limiting factor and we should go beyond. And these occultists that you're so critical of, their whole thing is trying to explore beyond the constraints of what we see and feel in the physical five sense reality. So I don't know. I just don't see that as bad because I'm not a Christian. So I see it as like, well, the Christian authorities for so long were like, any religion that isn't ours is bad. The pagans are bad. They all need to be killed. But I just don't see that stuff as necessarily evil. And then when you say the occult perversion of sacred geometry, we talked about the Platonic solids. I guess I want to understand, like just to try to narrow down on one specific thing, how have the occultists made sacred geometry some kind of perverse thing as opposed to a way to understand the natural world through proportion and ratio, as you kind of described earlier? What's the twist that they put on that?
Okay. Again, so many elements on there.
I know. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's fun. I'll give so number one, when I mentioned that if I could call myself anything, it would be a Platonist. Plato was not a Christian. He lived centuries before Christianity was ever a thing.
Right.
So, just to get across.
Yeah,
I'm not exactly,
I shouldn't label you like that. I'm just saying you have a very similar take to Christians with a lot of this other stuff.
No, yeah, I know. So I also wrote a series of books called The Clash of the Two Americas in 4 volumes. And, I've done a series of essays that are essentially that could have been called the clash of the two Christianities. And I tried to get across in there how you have, just like you have this authentic, freedom loving America that has a good tradition of which most of its leaders tend to get murdered, like 8 presidents dying while in office, who are trying to invoke something very similar as a policy and paradigm outlook, domestic and foreign. So too, do you have something similar as a heritage, as a battle within the thing calling itself Christianity, between something that is, I would say, really, really beautiful and good and very tolerant and not rigid. And then another thing, which is super, super rigid and intolerant and dogmatic and doctrinaire, which tends to also be promoted, ironically, by those very same occultists who have wanted to also destroy Christianity from within. So in the same, there's an irony there. There's a deep, deep irony.
That's the part I don't see. Like Rudolf Steiner, you think was trying to pervert Christianity.
Well, so like the way, for example, Francis Yates and others correctly, I would say, get across that the Jesuits and the Rosicrucians are sort of the same thing, but with 2 different polar opposites. It's the polar opposite of the same thing. Similar Gnostic origins for both. Gnosticism. Yeah, I could say that. Yeah, they have Gnostic sort of roots, but there's an occultism at the heart of Ignatius Loyola's meditations, his origin story, and the John Dee, Robert Flood, Bacon groupings as well. And they created a schism. The Jesuits at in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries provided the most reactionary, rigid, ultra-violent, abusive Christianity possibly imaginable that was being promoted through their operations within the Habsburg Empire, especially, but also in wherever they would get access in the French Empire as well, wherever they could influence things, they would tend to try to bring about the most rigid, tyrannical expression of ignorant Christianity. But at the same time, they were also known, ironically, as this chameleon-like thing that could take on a variety of different flavors pretty easily too. So they've got this interesting quality, right?
They always do.
They really do. And they would be able to ingratiate themselves to targeted native populations in Japan, in China, in the Americas, South and North and Central. So they're really good at learning languages. They're very disciplined at learning a target people's language, and then even because of their meditation exercises, they would visualize the burning in hell for years on end. They would smell their flesh burning. They would then do the opposite at meditations, go into an altered state as well over time by imagining the type of visceral, extreme pleasures you would get in their idea of what heaven would be. So they would do all of these exercises that made it pretty easy for them to get flayed alive at different times and tortured violently by being boiled to death at different moments, which happened a lot, because they're obviously trying to influence whole cultures that often are not going to be too happy, whether in Africa or in North America, with having a new sacred story being given to you by foreigners. So it's not easy to do that, but they were good at it. And they started becoming renowned over the centuries, especially in the Americas, for creating new sacred origin stories for the very natives themselves that they had ingratiated themselves into and targeted, whether it was the Algonquins, there's so many cases. My wife actually wrote a whole book on this, on Jesuits, Freemasons, and anthropologists and the making of a new world religion, where she goes through how the Jesuits, with some Freemasonic assistance, created the ghost dance religion as sort of this messianic end times religion of a world teacher that would emerge at the end times if people wore their special ghost dance shirts and would be immune from bullets. Complete sick joke designed to get these people to self-exterminate and give them a false sense of what their origins were, which is a wild irony. So at this point, I don't even know where are the authentic native stories that were not influenced by centuries of Jesuit manipulation.
It's a fair point.
A practical example I have directly, and I've lived through this in a few different examples, but my wife and I, we had a fight. We didn't talk for 3 years before we got married, right? So we were friends. We had a fight, didn't talk for 3 years, but she was always in the back of my mind a little bit, and I was in the back of her mind a little bit from now and again. And at one moment, an impulse did strike me that I needed to call her after about a year and a half of us not talking. And I called her up. Her line was busy. I was like, okay, it didn't work out. Forgot about it for another year and a half. Then, well, no, actually, then I got to my office and I found out that she had been trying to get my number. So she was on the phone with an old friend of mine trying to figure out what my number was. So that was an interesting thing that I discovered, but we didn't get around to actually touching base. Didn't think about her again for another year and a half. And then all of a sudden I got this inspiration, something hit me and I was like, okay, I want to contact her. So I texted her and I found her number and I texted her and she had, for the first time, been watching videos of me on YouTube because I had been giving classes at that time. And she was just doing that the night before for the first time in like 3 years. She just decided to do a Google search of me. This is 2013. And so she was like, and she was getting very sad that she, wasted this chance to have a friendship and a relationship with me years earlier. So she was super sad, and I didn't know she was doing that, but I had this impulse to write to her at that moment, and she was super happy because she was like, she felt like she couldn't reach out to me, and I went and texted her. She got my message that morning. So then we got together, and we took it much more seriously at that point, how much we valued each other, and we grew a relationship out of that, and later got married. I can't account for that logically. I do think that there was a psycho-spiritual connection that was definitely communicated in a way that modern science cannot yet account for. It doesn't mean it can never account for it. But so, I'm totally open to things that one could categorize as supernatural in that sense, or ESP or whatever, there's an element of that. So I'm open to these things. And I've had other examples that are similar. Again, for me, my problem is just that when I look at the agencies that have been infiltrating and changing the character of my society over the dead bodies of many great presidents and Martin Luther King Jr. and others, tied to what I have studied about the deeper history, I noticed that a lot of those followers of people like, and if you've read my book on the Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Volume 3, you got a sense that what I was getting at, you've alluded to it, those characters around the esoteric section of Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy, there was an esoteric section, were all tied to the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn that was set up in 1886, that set up the Isis Urania Lodge in 1887, that were all founding members of the esoteric section, which was the section where you're not allowed to because you have the exo and the eso, right? So the exoteric section for the public, for the uninitiated, is really kind of okay. I mean, there's nothing I could find as massive fault in a lot of the public writings of whether it's Blavatsky per se. I mean, there's things I find distasteful, but overall, it's not like there's anything reprehensible. But then wherever you find these agencies, there's this esoteric teaching, which you can only access if you've been put through a certain process, and that will never be allowed to be made public. And that's where you have to sort of triangulate into, well, what is that? And you judge the fruit by its actions. So when I look at things like the ritual murders of the Whitechapel murders of Jack the Ripper, which I was surprised to find that was directly tied into the Sybil's Cave murder of Mary Rogers 2 decades or 3 decades earlier, as well as the attempted reconstruction of Solomon's Temple, overseen by Charles Warren, the second this is one of the top Grand Masters of global United Grand Lodge Freemasonry. That same Charles Warren, who's overseeing the excavation, working with Richard Burton, who's inspiring Aleister Crowley, and then who's overseeing the Jack the Ripper murders as the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, along with another figure whose name is escaping me. But you have a whole network of people killing women, positioning them in the configuration of the Vesca Pisces in England at that time, who are directly tied to an operation which involves the reactivation of the reconstruction of Solomon's Temple that I see today as being something that's shaping all of the many global policies that are very destructive are being shaped by the cult that wants to revive Solomon's Temple. And I look at their writings and how they envision what is Solomon and what was the temple in their minds. Like, so I read the Testament of Solomon that Crowley was also following, which seemed to have come out of the 12th century occult networks tied to the same thing that had spawned the Knights Templar, who had their home base under Solomon's Temple, that were doing weird rituals, it seems. And I do believe that there's some validity to this, to Baphomet as an androgynous deity underneath Solomon's Temple in Solomon's mines. But they had this view of reconstructing this thing as part of an eschatological sort of ritual to end an age and bring in a new age. That's sort of what I see today, is the same thing behind Solomon's Temple today. And so they're doing a lot of evil. They're spawning people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who, as I point out in chapter 11 of the Edgar Allan Poe book, was found to be, and Houdini, Harry Houdini, who was exposing a lot of these things, found with the help of Harry Day, a member of Parliament of England, found that Conan Doyle was playing a role within this mass child abduction ring from orphanages in London that were getting these orphans to be taken in by New York Eastern establishment families.
Orphan train stuff.
Yeah, and then they found one of the bodies of one of the children who had disappeared from a London orphanage on the actual terrain of a leading American family. Damn it, it'll come later. Anyway, but they found the actual dead body of one of these sacrificed children on the terrain of one of these leading families that was also overseeing this spiritualist movement that Harry Houdini was exposing as being a bunch of lying frauds.
Mm-hmm.
But Conan Doyle, who is also working with crooks, at the Society for Psychical Research, he's part of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He's thus interfacing with Crowley. These people are part of things that are Crowley's talking about how to select the best human sacrifice, the best child for one of your a certain type of magical working. These are people who are doing very, very nefarious things.
Right.
And they've got a very, very sick idea of what this new age that they want to bring into being is going to be. They're overseeing the creation of like, he's bringing in Thelema into the Nazi high command's architecture through JCR Fuller, who's the head of his Argentum Astrum Lodge,
right,
who's the back channel to Hitler directly. These guys are like doing that. And then he's got a disciple who ends up creating a Scientology degree of initiation UFO cult that then goes on to have many of its leading members who are interfacing with Esalen, who are overseeing the creation of the SRI, who are, many of them. It's not just Hal Puthoff. It's not just Ingo Swann. There's a number of these high level, like operating thetan high initiates who go to like 7 or 8. Who are all then overseeing this thing sanctioned by the CIA that's also doing MK Ultra, that are working with Jacques Vallée, who's, by the way, also saying openly that he's friends with Kenneth Anger and Anton LaVey, and working with Michael Aquino, who's overseeing, the introduction of Satanism into the military, which is then doing so much damage. So I'm like, are these people legit? Like, do I really, really believe the scientific sort of outcomes that they are overseeing in their controlled experiments that are also being funded by Lawrence Rockefeller, who's playing such a big role in transforming the USA into an evil empire on the one hand, and then promoting all of this like discover yourself through drug stuff on the other hand? Does he really care about me? And also funding the UFO disclosure thing, and also the SRI. Like, this guy's everywhere, and he's funding like Russian mystics as well to take part in funding both the Soviet side and the American side throughout the 70s to cohere in developing joint scientific studies on ESP together. Do I believe these guys? Why do I believe these guys?
Right. Yeah, that was really good. I didn't want to interrupt you when you really started cooking with gas there and breaking that down. But and the irony is that I do agree with you that if we're looking at what seems to be trying to be built today, it is this techno psychedelic UFO one religion without an actual God in it, and everything centralized under the AI. Like, I think we agree that things are going in that direction, and you're looking at the deep history of where do a lot of these ideas come from, who put them out there. I guess I think our difference is that I see this wider reality of a wider consciousness as just kind of a neutral fact. And then you have people in authority who have tried to deny that to the rest of us by saying, you can't use psychedelics, just come to our church, we'll give you all the answers. You can't explore these things. And then, of course, they have been weaponized too. So I see it as there's a neutral, wider than the material world out there. it's been denied to the majority of people and then been weaponized by a few. It's kind of like I've done so many shows talking about how occultists, broadly speaking, are really the apex of the power pyramid. And you call them Rosicrucians. We're really talking about a similar kind of thing. But that's the weaponizing of a neutral aspect of reality. Like, let's take remote viewing, for example, a very neutral side effect that seems to be real. I've had it tested and I had a few hits. I was like, wow, how is this possible? Well, it's the greater consciousness is just everything's connected, I guess, in some weird way. And then, yes, that mechanism, that tool was weaponized. And they said, well, how can we take this and apply it to a military context? How can we use it for spycraft? Sure. But that doesn't mean the function of remote viewing is somehow nefarious or wrapped up with something negative. It's just like, this is something denied to the masses and experimented on behind closed doors to see how it can be used against us. But I guess that's where I draw a line between the neutral aspects of reality and how they've been used. And it seems like, yeah, there's some bad people who have a monopoly on their use because they're denied to the rest of us.
Yeah, I gave my example of my little telepathic sort of connection with my wife. So I'm certainly open to an element of this. To what degree, though, we find a usefulness in military applications? Because so here's my thing, right? My problem that I have when I'm thinking about these things is that it seems like a cult of that tends to be very much tied to Satanism, has been incubated and has grown to increasingly completely dominate. Though they represent perhaps a minority who are self-aware of what they are, their influence is disproportionately massive and has been so since even during the time of John F. Kennedy. This is a sort of thing that when in my documentary series, I'm going through a network of these groups that oversaw, that were organized around Allen Dulles and that oversaw things like the Vietnam War that JFK was trying to pull America out of, but they wanted to go in. Now, they didn't just want to go in for purely material geopolitical considerations. I think they also saw it as a sacred war, like a sacred murder. And that's part of one of the core formulas that I'm noticing of this so-called self-professed high priesthood or elite sorcerer class is that they have this obsession with fusing opposites, especially moral opposites, together. So like the profane and the sacred have to be merged as much as possible. War increasingly from their eyes is seen as a sacred cleansing, a purgative, a healing thing, ultimately a necessary evil for a greater good, where we can then be more that the population that went through the purge, the trauma, will be thus more open to transformation. This is like the spiritual alchemy stuff. The Michael Meyer idea of the phoenixing of a society, which I think was a big part of the formula or the ritual of the working of those who organized the 30 Years' War, who are followers of Michael Meyer. The phoenixing of the moment is the phoenix of the society is basically just that. And maybe there's a healthy interpretation of that, but I know Operation Phoenix was not a coincidence that they selected that particular name for the most virulent mass murder, torture, kill operation of the Vietnam War, which Michael Aquino was a leading member of. So is Edward Lansdale. So is John Alexander, the death science guy who oversees and works very closely with Hal Puthoff, and went through the SRI. They selected that. 40,000 people, mostly civilians, were mass executed. The My Lai Village massacre was just one of many. But it was basically a way to hone and create a more organized mercenary class of high priests that would then go on and carry out a deeper infiltration of U.S. institutions and transform the world in this weird image that they have in their mind. I think the Changing Images of Men operation that grew out of the SRI at that same time with Willis Harman and Carl Jung's disciple, what's his name, John Campbell, and Marilyn Ferguson, who did the Aquarian Conspiracy, was on that team, though she's not registered, but she's actually a direct assistant to Willis Harman. These guys they tend to be the most disgusting human beings who have been deconstructed. Maybe they themselves, I'm sure they went through their own trauma and their own abuses that brought them to a place that caused them to be reconstructed in a more vicious light. But they're such deeply sick individuals that have so much influence on turning my society into a basket case of evil that I don't know what to trust when it comes to them saying they have gotten these effects scientifically, whether it was at the SRI projects on remote viewing and the Stargate project, or even in their practical application of identifying enemy Al-Qaeda bases in Afghanistan. How much of that is actually legit and how much was already contrived? Like, how easy is it to just simply already have the data, that you've acquired through intelligence networks, and then say, okay, here are the positions, the coordinates that will then be given by the remote viewer that are then turn out to be true when the drone strikes them. So, and then all of a sudden that then just justifies, especially in the minds of, I think many of those that they've wanted to convert are not your average plebe citizen. They've wanted to really convert their top brass,
Right.
like that, and the people working in intelligence are their main targets of intellectual conversion.
Fair
and
enough.
The more people they can get on board, the less we have as a real guardian class that can protect free society from this death cult. And that's my concern.
I understand that concern. I would say if you don't know what to trust the personal experience, because I've had my own personal experiences, just like you described your own. That is a thread to pull on, that kind of takes you to the deeper reality. I would say trust your own experiences. I don't know if you've had any psychedelic experiences. I would say probably not.
Sure.
You have?
Yeah. Oh. I was huge into mushrooms, man. I was a psilocybin guy.
Well, then you should be on my page. But so I don't want to run out of time without talking about two things, and I think we're going to. But UFOs and China. You have such unique takes on China that I have to fit it in. But just to use UFOs as an example of this larger thing we're trying to talk about, your series is great. You break down all the military intelligence people that are involved in crafting the stories and crafting, Roswell and the aviary and all these people, Hal Puthoff and Jacques Vallée, and you say this is the new invisible college. These people are trying to seed a mythos that gets us into this techno-psychedelic, Gnostic, one world government. Okay. I think the nuance there for me is I acknowledge almost everything you say in that series as true and as manipulation, but they're not making it up out of whole cloth. They're manipulating an actual reality of people having experiences with something non-human, and then they're twisting it to say, well, these are aliens from another planet, and, Darwinist evolution is going to take us there, and this is a good thing, and we should all want to go that direction. Like, that's the H.G. Wells stuff that you fold in, the Mars stuff you fold in. Yeah, I can acknowledge that. But are you of the position that what we call ufology is just nothing, that hundreds of thousands of people don't have visitations in their room from something very strange that takes them out of body to another reality, gives them some weird download? Are you of the opinion that all of that is made up?
There's a hold on, I'm just trying to get the name of the book here
because
I have in the other room.
All I want to say is just because I think that there's a spiritual nature of something that has always existed with us, and they're twisting that to make it ufology.
Okay. So here's my considerations on that question and that very important topic. I'm assuming you don't have a hard stop after 2 hours, do you? Or is it a hard stop?
No, we can go a little longer if we need to.
Okay. All right. I'll still try to keep it short, but so David McGowan, excellent contemporary researcher. So he wrote a book called Programmed to Kill, and it's a fantastic book. His more famous book is Strange Things at Laurel Canyon.
Right.
But the Programmed to Kill book that he wrote before that examines all of the cases of known serial killers over the past, I think he takes about a century of a data set. And he just goes through each case study to try to see, kind of like what I did with the Jack the Ripper murder, are these naturally occurring as we've been told? Cases like the Zodiac Killer and others, or is there evidence of occult ritual operations within and around those murders? And he finds that in every single case, there was occult and intelligence operations tied to each one of those cases of seemingly, we're told, discontinuous, discrete cases of serial killers. I think of which Michael Aquino played a role in the Zodiac Killer one too, with the Process Church of Final Judgment, which is also a Scientology outgrowth of 62, and that's tied to Charles Manson. Now, the thing about this stuff is that Charles Manson thing comes up quite a bit. There was, I've noticed in my research, a practice amongst many of these various cults of the 60s and 70s that really grew out in the 70s, like they really blossomed big time. There was, as Charles Manson called it, the practice, it was a ritual of creepy crawly. And people could Google creepy crawly Charles Manson family. And this is something that was done to thousands of households where the family was told to go in and look for houses in suburb neighborhoods and other places that have unlocked doors or windows and creep and crawl into the house and move things around. And, that was one thing that was, there's one aspect of it which has been documented, which involves, how this was done to both just put in a little bit of a scare into the population, but nothing really harmful. But within my line of research, it wouldn't be, because the case of mass, like personal abductions, and especially the sexual molestation and the violence committed to a lot of the people who go through alien abduction cases and tell their story about it. There is a strange amount of anal rape, which is something that tends to occur, or anal examination with a probing. That is a thing. It's a weird thing that aliens coming from another galaxy would be so obsessed with.
I think that was something the media made in the 80s and 90s. They hyped it up to make it look
but it was there. It was a disproportionately large amount of people.
The people I know who have had these experiences don't have that. But yeah, I mean, sure, it's in the mix.
Pregnant. Oh, you got the happy ones too. But in that time, it was in the 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s, when it really blossomed as far as the cases. Because before 62, you didn't really have any cases of that sort of disturbing form. There was like the case of the Venusian space brothers that came and brought George Adamski into their ship. Mm-hmm. There were the more like beautiful Aryan kind of people. But then you had the more warped versions, the more scary versions that started coming out of the 60s slowly. But then in the 70s, they blossomed. So my mind would want, I don't know how investigatable this is, but that it wouldn't be hard for me to imagine how the creepy crawly type of practice could involve taking people in their sleep, giving them a bit of chlorophyll or something else to put them in even deeper of a sleep, maybe with some masks, maybe coordinated those masks, and then remove them to do things to those people in the 70s, at which they're left either in the forest or brought back into their bedroom. I don't know. And then that creates, in a dazed, drugged out state, people who might be told how to interpret what they just experienced by information channels that are open to them, letting them know that it was actually aliens that did that to you, that brought the light into your room and other things, that caused your ass to hurt or whatever else. For me, I don't know I don't think that work has been done. I would challenge people. I know, but knowing that is a thing, my mind goes there more than anywhere else to try to say, let's figure out if that accounts for a lot of these cases of abuse and extraterrestrial abductions,
right?
At that time,
usually that's framed as my lab experiences, my lab abductions. Military abductions that simulate the things that are going on, or maybe change them around to include some of the more nefarious aspects of it. But I just wanted to hone in on, you don't think that there is communication with non-human intelligence?
No,
at all?
I don't.
You don't think there are spirits and demons and multidimensional entities and these kind of things at all?
No, I think the oligarchy believes in these things, but I don't think that they're real. I think that the oligarchy drives themselves into a form of schizophrenia and disembodied states of identities that Edgar Allan Poe documents in his short stories, like The Imp of the Perverse, pretty well, or William Wilson is another short story by Poe, where he goes through this higher type of schismed identity that has a demonic character that the oligarchy does to themselves, that they build whole mythologies around and organizing principles around, that they then project as stories for everybody else to also fall into. But I don't think that that's actually true. I don't think there are these forces for good or for bad, or light or darkness, that they interface with.
Yeah, see, that's what I was trying to get to, is just a straight answer on your thoughts on what is at the bottom of ufology, and you basically think it's nothing, that it's all created by military intelligence and these Rosicrucians and this invisible college to create something that isn't really there. Whereas my distinction is that I think they are taking a reality that's always existed with humanity, a larger than material world, a larger hierarchy of conscious intelligences, and then trying to change the wrapper on that from a spiritual dichotomy to a more sci-fi reality. So that's the distinction that we have on that specific issue. But regardless, I do love having ideas challenged. I mean, you go on these.
Well, I would say, look, Jacques Vallée did write some good books. His books are pretty useful, even though I think he is probably himself a Satanist.
See, I think that's
But-
interesting.
But his books are so useful, and he's the first to really document the occult sort of overlap with a lot of the cases of aliens and the interdimensional idea that he introduces with his Passenger to Magonia. And he does map out the different folklores of imps and child abductions from different villages in Sweden and Ireland, going back to the Middle Ages, and how different names were given to these entities, these elves and gnomes and
Right.
different things, fairies, that he says is what these more primitive peoples would have given as the name for the aliens that they were seeing, but they didn't know what to call them, or the demons, which might be the same thing because they're leaping from another dimension,
Right.
which maybe was where they exist and into ours, and they abduct kids. I would say what my mind finds more, I was going to say attractive, repulsive, but yet still what I'm attracted to as a hypothesis. We know of all of these witch covens and Marina Abramovich's networks. She's not solo. She didn't come out of a vacuum. She's overseeing like the child safety. She's the child safety ambassador for Ukraine, which has the biggest like child abduction racket in the world. But that again has been an unbroken continuity of witch covens that go back, overseen by warlocks and other things that have a weird sacred fetish about killing children. They seem to really want that. The human sacrifice in general is part of their ritual.
Yeah, I mean, I don't deny that. I just think that's the dark application of a magical reality. It doesn't have to be dark. Just like, regular murder.
Yeah, maybe not. But I'm saying what does seem to be present and pervasive throughout this whole thing is that there has been a lot of cases, whether it's the warnings of the Grimm brothers for Hansel and Gretel, or the warning of the Pied Piper taking the kids away, is that there has been an ongoing plague of secret cults that have been murdering people in secret, passing themselves off under the guise of mystery that you can't understand, that have been there in an unbroken manner. And it take that, whatever that mystery is, as a wall that's going to prevent your reason from understanding what they're doing. It takes on different forms at different ages, but the effect is always the same. And so I just see the UFO story as the most recent iteration of that exact same technique of creating a wall that reason cannot trespass beyond, that would otherwise help us understand the nature of this very sick, parasitical thing that the oligarchy is and does as part of their ritual, like their own religion, governing and fucking up society.
Yeah, it's really interesting just to hear you talk, because it really is like I have to go sentence by sentence and be like, oh, I really agree with that sentence. Oh, that's where I differ. It's just really interesting because that's not a dichotomy I'm used to with a lot of people. And so we have to talk about China a little bit. Let's bring it back to the modern day before we run out of time. So you're a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. Your wife and you work on a lot of books together. She's Chinese. Together you wrote a 2-volume set titled Breaking Free of Anti-China Psyops. You seem to be in favor of the New Belt and Road Initiative. I've heard you talk about it a little bit. I understand that the Western globalists are constantly saying Russia and China are bad, but I don't know that there is a good guy here. China and Russia don't really seem to be the beacons of freedom that you write about them as. You say the Uyghur genocide thing is propaganda, the organ harvesting is propaganda. It seems like you say the human rights abuses aren't real. And this is why you have a lot of critics online. There's always critics. I have critics too, but there's a lot of critics that think that you're funded by China and Russia. And I don't ever think we need to go that far. Like, why can't we just kind of say that just because someone has criticisms of the way we look at other nations doesn't mean they're on the payroll? But I guess it's like, yes, I acknowledge there's some adversarial propaganda coming from the West. No doubt. You'd be dumb not to think that. But I don't know if that covers the full spread of everything. I mean, don't you think China has its own human rights abuses? Is there no Uyghur genocide or surveillance state social crediting system to keep critics in line? Is this all Western fabrication?
We should almost have a whole show
I
on
know,
this.
I'm sorry, but
because these are not little
I know.
questions. And do you want to do a whole show on this at some point? I mean, we could sit down and actually like go through it case by case.
Well, I have to read that 2-volume book, and then I would say yes, but try to set the stage for us.
Okay. All right. Well, here. So I tend to try to conduct my analysis utilizing as much of an understanding of the techniques of counterintelligence and propaganda that I could possibly understand, and with an appreciation for trying to, I guess, define this death cult, this thing that's been latching on to humanity for thousands of years, that always has the same kind of desire at in its heart and mind, whatever its heart is, which is essentially the same thing. It's global depopulation, stasis, divide to conquer as a way of being, right? Keep people as divided within themselves and with their neighbors as possible through a variety of techniques that involve bringing out the worst in us as humanly possible through our education, our culture, our arts, or there's different ways of bringing out the worst part of people. We've got a better and a worse part. They're good at the science of making us bad or making us worse than we could be. And so I try to map that out as best as I can, and with this sense that there has been this positive thing that gave rise to the American Revolution, that gave rise to all of these amazing blasts of freedom and progress against the will of the oligarchy that have been really good, really great for humanity and really inspiring. So I try to like do that in my mind as I'm carrying out my analysis of current events. The thing with a lot of the narratives that I scratch upon, looking at like different reasons for us to think about China or Russia in a certain way, or Iran and the Muslim world in a certain way, usually fall apart when I do my analysis. And I noticed that you mentioned, I'm the senior fellow of the American University in Moscow, not paid, no money coming in from Russia or nothing like that. My wife has a Chinese last name. Her mom was born in Hong Kong. Moved here when she was a young girl. My wife has been born Canadian, doesn't speak Chinese, doesn't get paid from China. So we don't that's not, I know a lot of people have come out and I've encountered these types of statements, which is why I'm saying it right now. Because people say, oh, your wife has a Chinese last name. She's a Chinese agent. You've worked with the American University in Moscow. You're a Russian agent. I've gotten these things. So I'm saying it that way. So I look for the origins of narratives. Where are they coming from? And what evidence do I actually find that's available to my reason, my inquiring reason, to see if those narratives are true or false. So when it comes to those ones that you just mentioned, and again, my Breaking Free of Anti-China PSYOPs, Volume 1 and Volume 2, go through a lot more detail than I'm going to do right now. I'm also making some videos going through this to try to add some multimedia dimension, and people can try to validate or disprove the claims that I'm making in the context of these arguments, which I can't do justice to in this quick thing. But I would say for the Uyghur genocide claims, no, there's no. So the thing about China and the Muslims in Xinjiang is that China shares a 75-kilometer border with Afghanistan, and the reason why there was the problem of Islamic terrorism, what has everything to do with the fact that back in especially in the 70s, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, but especially Zbigniew, had a program called Operation Cyclone that had a great idea to start promoting, putting I think they put $500 million of U.S. taxpayer money, also conduited through the Saudis and at the time Pakistani intelligence, to creating these radicalizing madrasas, especially in Afghanistan, that would try to bring about the worst possible, most violent reactionary interpretation of Islam that would teach young men how to interpret the messages within their Quran, that would then tend to, through the Wahhabist and Salafist doctrination, produce people who would be much more inclined to blow themselves up and become essentially, though they knew it though they didn't even know it most of the time, proxies for the USA in a war against Russia that would draw in Russia to weaken the Soviet Union. So that was like the origins of what became modern Al-Qaeda. Now, that didn't stop when the Soviet Union collapsed. They continued doing that. They continued funding that, and people looking at, you know, the real story behind 9/11 or what was behind, you know, ISIS today, whether in Syria or Libya or Iraq or Africa, you'll find MI6 and the CIA all over the place. So the Chinese had a problem where they shared this border with an area that went radicalized, that involved also CIA annexes in Xinjiang that were set up in the late 70s, throughout the 80s, into the 90s, that were running there, overseeing the incubation of radicalizing young men in mosques that would, again, receive their money from the Saudis at that time in the 90s, 80s, 90s, and that would then send them via support with Turkey, which is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, to go and fight proxy wars in Syria and Libya, where they cut their teeth as head choppers. By the year 2005-06, the terrorism started coming into China, and they had about 180 different cases of terrorist activity, small and big, in Xinjiang, but it was spreading around. It was really spreading quite a bit. China didn't cause that problem, but they had to then deal with, what do you do with the consequences of a bunch of indoctrinated young Muslim men who are declaring war because they want to create, East Turkestan, which is the entire province of Xinjiang. They call Turkestan, which is also what a lot of National Endowment for Democracy, aka CIA, think tanks also call that area of China. In a lot of the think tanks that are in Washington or in Australia, or they call that area of China East Turkestan. They don't believe it should be part of China, that it should be carved out. And it's a balkanization doctrine. The same thing is that you see with a lot of these think tanks that look at the Russian map, and they have, you can Google it online, there's 14 different sub-federations that they want to create little micro ethno states out of, under the control of the IMF and the World Bank. So that's part of the technique. Now, China had to deal with that problem. Part of what they did is they didn't bomb any other countries the way we did when we had a Muslim problem, like a Muslim terrorist problem. They had to do it without bombing anybody, which they did through an economic development strategy. So if you look at Xinjiang and the Xinjiang genocide, or the Muslim genocide problem that we've all been told, we who actually are part of countries that did kill millions of Muslims and are still doing it, but we've been told to be all bleeding heart and sympathetic to apparently these abused Muslims all of a sudden we should care about in China, who went from having a life expectancy of 39 years of age in 1975 to 76 years of age today. The population itself has more than tripled in that same period of time. They have had although the Chinese, through the Club of Rome and Henry Kissinger in 79-80, did impose a one-child policy on themselves. Through the Club of Rome, when they brought in the Club of Rome, which is, again, a David Rockefeller operation that brought in these computer models to justify depopulation, that was one of the conditions upon which they would be granted the right to have access to factories that Kissinger then oversaw. So they did that to themselves, but they never applied it to the Muslims. They never applied it to their ethnic minority groups. They never applied it to the Tibetans. So they only applied it to the Han Chinese, which they then finally ended in 2015 when they realized how much self-mutilation they conducted on themselves. So there's no more one China policy. However, they didn't do it to the Muslims. The Muslims as well, there's 26,000 mosques today in Xinjiang, which per capita is more than any other non-Muslim country in the world. More than the United States as far as people per capita having access to mosques. It's more than the USA. It's more than any country in Europe, even though Europe is being flooded by George Soros's operations to get, a bunch of Muslims whose countries we bombed to the Stone Age, who can't live there anymore, who are then being sent in and being deployed to create havoc in North America and in Europe. But despite that, the per capita access to mosques is of the highest outside of any non-Arab or any Arab country, Muslim country. The quality of life and job opportunities. So a lot of these so-called concentration camps, when you actually, Brian Berletic actually is a former US soldier who now lives in Thailand and has a great channel called New Atlas. And his analysis of both the Ukraine front as well as the Uyghur genocide claims is impeccable.
Okay.
He's the most rigorous guy I know. Brian Berletic, New Atlas, YouTube. He's good. Just type in China Uyghur. You'll find hundreds of videos. He's the most rigorous guy I found, who's debunked the idea that there are these concentration camps. The information that they're using is based upon selective data from satellites that ignore shit tons of data that would disprove the claims that they want as an outcome. You have trade schools and you have new industrial corridors, tons of jobs being built, like I said, in in Xinjiang, entrepreneurialism is increasing massively, and they're not losing their culture. You have everyone there is still as part of the education system. The local dialects and cultures are still being taught at the same time as they're also learning Mandarin. At the same time as they're learning for the first time real skills that are giving them job opportunities, so they don't want to blow themselves up because they have no hope for the future. So that's something that's going on, which is pissing off a lot of the CIA front groups around the National Endowment for Democracy, of which I list many of them in my special report, that are also tied to British intelligence and Australia. On the organ harvesting thing, that's a whole thing that's going to require we go into Falun Gong, which is...
Yeah, and I actually was going to bring on Falun Gong. You say they're the next thing you're going to cover in your UFO series, so maybe I should just wait till that is out. But yeah, Falun Gong, I only hear about them in the context of this being the group that is having their organs harvested. You call them an Asian UFO cult, so I assume you don't like them all that much. But I know this is a lot to unpack, but I appreciate you at least unpacking the Uyghur thing. That is a framing that I've never heard. It does make logical sense when I'm following what the globalists tend to do. So yeah, they are responding to a problem that was created by the globalists and the meddlers. That's a story as old as time. So many things seem to be that, but it's framed as just a racist, oppressive, we just don't like these people, so they're now in concentration camps. And it seems to be, like a lot of things, the story needs to be started earlier to see how that problem arose and who actually started the problem, rather than crying wolf and being like, hey, look at this. As you say, it's very hypocritical given all the things our country does. But man, really interesting. I still have so many questions, even about Tesla. We went so far off the map from even...
Oh, yeah, that was the whole point. Hey, we were going to talk about Tesla.
It's all good.
We didn't
it's
really
all
do
good.
that.
Your work is so dense and deep, and I've spent all week trying to package it up into somehow getting a lot of things into a 2-hour conversation, and well, people will judge how we did. But tell people where they can dig deeper into the many irons in the fire that you have. Give them your links and all that good stuff.
Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, this is a fun way to start my day. This is cool. So I guess for the plug. So Revenge of the Mystery Cults, volumes 1 to 3. I did them all at the same time. And I published them before last Christmas. So those are all easy to find on CanadianPatriot.org. That's my main geopolitical website. Also just Amazon, I guess you can just Google Revenge of the Mystery Cults with my name. Clash of the Two Americas that we've referenced a little bit. Also that quadrology is on there. And also I would say Science Unshackled is a book I wrote 2 years ago, going through sort of the clash of the two sciences from ancient times to the present in a bit more detail. So that complements, I think, the Revenge of the Mystery Cults and some of our dialogue that we've had today about Isaac Newton as a fraud and you know, all this other stuff. The movies, the Hidden Hand Behind UFOs, there's 4 episodes that are already out. 3 are free. 1 is paid behind like a $4 paywall. Sorry, but I just realized we're gonna go bankrupt if we didn't do that. So so that's available also on either CanadianPatriot.org or my Substack, which I put out stuff regularly. Last thing is risingtidefoundation.net is a little nonprofit. I started in Canada with my wife back in 2019 with a bit more of an educational focus. So yeah, those are things to check out.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time. Yeah, we didn't even talk about the fact that you're Canadian and you've described Canada as a synthetic British intelligence operation that sometimes has country-like moments, but is essentially just a plaything of the same old globalists, and that's a whole nother thing. So yeah, maybe sometime we'll do China and Canada and the Belt and Road Initiative and all that, but this was enjoyable. So many things to think about and re-examine my perspective on many, many things I took for granted. So thank you and take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Sweet Severance Season 2, people. What a show. I don't know why you're listening to me, unless, of course, you finished Severance, and then I guess it makes sense. Okay, now this one was pretty interesting to me. I think I'm walking away more confused in some ways about the guest's actual big picture positions on the things we talked about than usual. He clearly knows a lot of historical information and links between certain people that a lot of other researchers miss, but I had an outline planned here that is totally off from what actually happened, and it did feel a bit like a whirlwind. I do have to give him major props for being such a good speaker and having such excellent recall. Those things are a killer combination. But I've never heard a person link so many alternative minds together and come out so hard against the occultists in the shadows engineering reality, and then say, my gold standard is Ben Franklin and there is no reality to the occult. Honestly, it kind of sucks because I do all this prep work and I had plotted out, okay, I'm going to ask about Tesla, which is going to lead us into the conversation about Mars and certain people who claim to have communications from beings that live on Mars. And that's going to lead us into the idea of seeding aliens as an inevitable Darwinian evolutionary outcome, which is a part of his work I actually liked a lot. And we didn't even talk about that. He thinks Darwinian evolution and the humans from apes idea was seeded to explain our past, and then also the archetype of the alien, the gray, I guess, was created to push us towards that future, or to see this sort of space communism of drone-like, hive-minded collectivist beings with no personality or emotional depth. That would be the other bookend. Which, is a compelling premise, looping in H.G. Wells and the War of the Worlds radio play as not an accident, but an intentional live drill. And then I had some fun stuff to branch off of that. But Matt threw so much information into his responses that it got a bit tough to be methodical. Or I would ask about Tesla, and we get 10 minutes on Sir Isaac Newton, the Babylonian witch. Very interesting. But I'm not going to ask about Tesla again. I want to kind of move on to the other things on the outline. So it just seemed weird to me to lump in Tesla and Isaac Newton because history handles them both very differently, especially pre-internet. One was suppressed and his work destroyed, and the other one they teach us about in schools as the hero of modern physics. Kind of different framing there. So when I'm judging if something is part of the cultural social engineering op, I consider greatly how much energy is put into promoting a person above their peers. Tesla Edison, sure. Another paradigm is, Rudolf Steiner compared to other Christian philosophers. Wilhelm Reich, we know, was imprisoned, so that speaks for itself. And Matthew is highlighting some pretty obscure people as the nefarious influence over time, and that really doesn't mesh all that well to me. Also, the Society of Cincinnati. I hear them more often described as like an American Knights Templar, usually a force for negative influence. Some of you might know J.J. Vance, and he just wrote me up a big explanation of his work into the group, and he doesn't consider them all that favorable. Just so many areas where Matt would zig, where a lot of other researchers zagged, and it would throw me off, but I was still engaged with it, if that makes sense. Another mistake I made was assuming he was Christian, but I went through hours of his work, and he never really claimed any metaphysical or spiritual ground, and I just want to know because I want to understand the logic of where a person is coming from, because when a person says something like, Tesla might have built Wardenclyffe Tower so Crowley could speak to his handler Rudolf Steiner without detection, and then he has this attitude of anything alternative science, psychedelic, mental phenomenon, or occult adjacent is all negative and subversive. Well, those people tend to be Christian or Christian adjacent. If this, then that, right? It's like a flowchart thing. And I don't even blame them. I just want to know where a person is and all the pieces of their logic tree. And it was kind of hard to get that out of Matthew. Maybe he sensed a disagreement and didn't want to make it about all that. I could understand that attitude. I have it myself sometimes. But he said he's a Platonist, and I would have even wanted to dig into that a little bit more, because Platonism, to my understanding, those people do believe in a spirit world to a degree, or a perfected realm of forms, as it's usually described, and our physical world is an imperfect reflection of that. So he's not a materialist, but he's skeptical of all non-material phenomenon, and it was just hard for me to square those two things, I guess. He's done a great series on the hidden hand behind ufology, but my humble opinion is that the crucial flaw in it is that he concludes it was all made up from nothing. And I would conclude that the dynamics of a complex, almost eternal relationship with non-human intelligence interacting with us was co-opted and managed to fit within the tight little box of beings from some other planet. So we could both agree on the evolutionary track element I mentioned earlier. So like, that is great, but really the conclusions there, that's a huge distinction. And yet I can still get a lot of value out of his series. So who knows? I could be wrong too. That's just where I am today. But it's strange logic to me to dismiss all sci effects, remote viewing, and psychedelics and occult mechanisms and then say that the people engaging with this stuff and promoting it are the real nefarious force, the real shadow hand, the real power behind the curtain, because I think they engage with these things privately and suppress them culturally because they actually work. The CIA studied all this extended consciousness stuff because it's real, not because they wanted to seed in very obscure subcultures that never really went anywhere these ideas. It's not really like promotion in the same sense of like mainstream ideas are promoted. Again, especially pre-internet. You had to really dig to get into this stuff. So, I don't know. Despite that stuff, I still think it was good, mentally stimulating, action-packed, really chock full of information. I actually felt inadequate in defending my own position several times because I largely just wanted to let him talk and try to understand exactly what he thinks about what's real and what's fake. And I think he writes off a lot of real stuff just because unsavory characters have explored it. That's common. In the Plus Show is where we got to talk about ufology a little bit, where he did say he thinks it's a whole fabrication, not just a changing of the wrapper, but that nobody has these experiences. And if they do, he suggested that they would have been drugged by intelligence agents or chloroformed or maybe even pricked with a psychedelic to be tricked and made to believe they had this kind of experience. And man, I don't think you can put it all in that box, though I do think that has happened. We call them my lab experiences. But to put it all in that category dismisses so much that came before the CIA and from areas of the world way outside the CIA's purview. There's just really so many examples when you dig into it. It's just like, it can't all just be that. Another thing I did think was really interesting was the China stuff. Lots to unpack there too. What he said about the Uyghur situation, it kind of makes sense, but on the other side, they say it's a genocide to the tune of millions, and he says they're being given better lives and being de-radicalized and provided new opportunities. It's kind of hard to decide because those things are so far apart, it's tough to rectify. But I do find it interesting that no one ever really asks who the Uyghurs are or if there's any justification to control them or if the CIA was involved in radicalizing them. Like, that was really important context. We just tend to say, China bad, so of course they would treat a minority like this. We don't really think much further than that. It's very similar to the Russia-Ukraine thing. Well, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that's the start of the story. Never mind all the meddling that was going on beforehand, trying to loop them into NATO, trying to put the biofacilities there, the coup that happened a few years earlier. You know, you start circling someone with threats, and they might preemptively cross over their property line and be like, what are you doing over here? And that's not the same as like invading them because you're just a bloodthirsty egomaniac, as is presented. I'm really curious to know what the reviews will be of this one, and I'm going to lean on that rating system heavily here to see if you guys want more, if you want a China-focused interview, because I'm kind of lost when it comes to my general interpretation of how this will be received. He did write me a follow-up email, though, with some thoughts that I want to read, because it's very important that I feel that we didn't misrepresent anyone, and that guests come across as understood by the audience, so in that interest, let me read what he said. We sped through so many ideas yesterday, which deserved more convo. I just wanted to toss out some points of clarification on a couple of underbaked notions that I didn't get to elaborate on. On the OTO being Rosicrucian. If you asked an OTO follower, they might not say yes, and they are certainly not officially a Rosicrucian order. However, in my reading of these institutions, Rosicrucian orders are intrinsically secret, and if someone says they're running a Rosicrucian order publicly, then they're probably not actually in a genuine Rosicrucian order, but a lower order decoy, which most of its members may fully believe is Rosicrucian, since they do study Paracelsus, D, Flood, Zorzi, Hermes Trismegistus, Kabbalah, and Gnostic literature, etc. And they certainly carry out a variety of rituals as well. But again, if they have membership cards and publicly extol themselves as Rosicrucian, then they are not the real deal. However, Rosicrucians as a species type have some invariant qualities in that 1. They profess that their adepts have the power through gnosis and initiation to channel spirit entities and ascended masters who are part of a great brotherhood of immortals. 2, that these powers of communication are teachable only if someone has divine blood, according to Eliphas Levi, who I treat as one of my authorities on the subject, which is why there is such an obsession by so many adepts to prove they have aristocratic blood. This ties into one of the self-organizing myths of the oligarchical class, that the royal families of Europe are to varying degrees descendants of Jesus' babies via the Merovingian clans. Oh, and by the way, that Jesus was actually the avatar of the Sethians, Lucifer spirit, contained in the Nag Hammadi texts, who delivers secret oral teachings to his favorite initiates, and or are more earlier the progeny of the demonic entities of Elohim Nephilim, and can thus interface with elementals and archons to do their bidding, like their demon-controlling version of Solomon was able to do when he controlled the army of demons to build his temple, which is outlined in the 13th and 14th century Templar-crafted Testament of Solomon, which initiates wish to believe is ancient. Although this has been given a UFO rebranding in the last century, I think this belief has been consistent across the last 2 millennia, at least, but likely way longer back. They are also animated by an obsessive belief in a global alchemical reset or new golden age / new dawn, whatever necessitates a period of cataclysm, and a creation of a new type of humanity and global paradigm, which isn't a healthy one in my estimation. So from that standpoint, at least at the moment in my research, I would put the OTO as led by Kellner, Roos, and later Crowley as part of a direct lineage of the Templar tradition, and which fits the MO of true Rosicrucianism, although they are all still quite disposable in the grand scheme. I would place the integral fellowship of the Mahakakra, aka the Circle, as more influential than the OTO, although it is possible that at the higher degrees they are one, although still disposable. More influential than the OTO, I would place the highest degrees of the Memphis Mizram Lodge system, which Blavatsky had been initiated into and which Kellner was a member with Roos. This is an 1880 update of the Cagliostro Egyptian Rite, who I believe was a much more legit Rosicrucian order, although ultimately disposable too. You'll notice I'm placing emphasis on the disposability of these various agencies, right? Crowley burns out as a drug fiend, Roos becomes a pathetic shill cooed by Crowley after adopting Crowley's sex magica, Cagliostro is disposed of and dies in jail, Edward Kelly, John Dee's control, who I suspect was handling Dee, also goes out badly, Bulwer Lytton also lives a long time and is hugely influential, but a clear drug fiend and not able to control himself. Personally, I think the whole thing is a game within a game, since the cult engineers who spawned Rosicrucian in the form it took after 1614's Fama and 1616's Chemical Wedding were themselves part of the same organization which suffered a blow in 1314 when Demolay was burned. But the Templar order itself was created by a higher Benedictine grand strategy via Bernard de Clairvaux that also spawned the Hospitaliers, the esoteric inner sanctum of the Benedictines, get us closer to the movers of the movers. This involves looking into the cults of Isis, Demeter, and especially Mithra from a counterintelligence standpoint. A lot of this is in Volume 1 of my Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Mystery, Babylon, and the New Age. Lastly, just to make this point clear as possible, despite the narratives of Dame Frances Yates and so many others that the Rosicrucians spawned the Renaissance and modern science via their Invisible College Royal Society, I deny it. The evidence points to the opposite. They are responsible for infiltrating and subverting both the Renaissance and science with the help of their co-created Jesuit mirror image. Grail Knight Jedi versus evil Sith shit. Joseph Campbell and Young were all over this. So then I said to him, I know it was a whirlwind. I had a handful of things I really wanted to hit because I figured that's where the audience would most be interested, but time management got away from us. I do a wrap up after each episode. I'll be sure to pass this along to the listeners. If I'm kicking myself for leaving something out, it would be that because I get the impression you don't subscribe to spirits, manifestation, occult techniques actually working the way they're advertised. Do you think these people just have been in a cult of ideas that don't really have any basis in reality? I'm not a practicing occultist, of course, but it seems like these are very effective people. Would they really adopt superstitious beliefs that don't deliver some results? Isn't the depth of knowledge in the occult and the consciousness/reality relationship partly responsible for their effectiveness and success and power over time? I'm just curious what you might say, however brief. I didn't want him to spend a whole lot of time on this, but he came back and said, for the moment, what I can say is that I have seen no evidence of supernatural engagement that was not tainted by magician's trickery. The art of making the true appear false and the inverse occurred in both physical and metaphysical domains simultaneously, with the metaphysical, i.e., the domain of epistemological warfare, having been treated more responsibly by Plato in the course of his dialogues in the art of sophistry. Harry Houdini, Friedrich Schiller, and Poe's work on exposing this trickery on both meta and physical levels is also highly relevant. A lot of this was contained in my volume 3, Revenge of the Mystery Cults, and my wife's work on Friedrich Schiller's 1798 Ghost Seer is extremely valuable too. I'll put the links in the show notes. Also, my 2023 book, Science Unshackled, Restoring Causality in a World of Chaos, gets at all this from another angle. It also deals with your questions of theosophical, irrationalist reading of sacred geometry versus actual divine geometry, which is actually all geometry properly understood as derived from Pythagorean spheres. Whew, man. So again, it's like I have to go line by line and be like, oh, I agree with that. Or I don't really get what you're saying there. Like, it's like a real whipsaw of ideas to me. So those are at least some leads for people who want to get to know Matt's work better. Anyway, in Higherside news, we are in the new two-tiered reality of THC Plus and THC Plus TV. That is about the biggest thing I have going on. Just trying to manage a more complex system, but so far, so good. Obviously, this Plus show was super packed, and that is where we disagreed a bit more. Obviously, as you go on, that naturally is going to happen. He said he had a lot of psychedelic mushroom experience, and that's another thing I would have liked to have heard more about. But I always have the clock in mind, 2 hours is 2 hours. Either way, I appreciate his time and coming on so well prepared and presenting himself so well. As we do, we got to dust off the last episode and see what the rating was, and this would be John Perkins, the economic hitman himself. I loved it. I thought our rapport was really good, and he came off pretty likable, and of course that should be expected with his background, kind of professional likability and persuasiveness, and it seems like the people liked it too. Had I recorded it yesterday, this show would have been a perfect 5 stars, but right now it's a 4.9. Who cares? That is crazy. Very rare to have a show rated so high, universally loved. And that's great because he did come in pretty soft on USAID and a few other things. But again, we don't need people to check every box on some ideological checklist. And clearly a lot of listeners still liked it, even with those caveats. All right, and then next on the docket, as always, is a look at the meetup calendar, which I got right here. Next on the list is July 5th, the Roswell, New Mexico meetup during the UFO Fest at the Blackcock Brewery. July 16th, Ontario Ranch, California at the Brewhaven location there. And then July 16th, NOLO in New Haven, Connecticut. And then they're getting together on July 20th at the Crooked Q in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where I was born. And July 21st, Galbraith's Ale House, Eden Terrace, Auckland, New Zealand. That one keeps coming around again. Awesome stuff, though. I'm glad people are getting together. HighersideMeetups.com to make events and find details about the ones I just read out, and you can meet new like-minded locals. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Matt for spending the time with me. I will catch you on the next one. I've done my part. Your move, Tesla archetype engineers, alternative culture creators, and UFO psyop seeders. Your fucking move.
Is it accidental how things end up? Or is life ritually planned right from the jump?